That's the latest news on the Twins. They are at Orlando today at 1:30 playing Pittsburgh.
Every day's a brand new day. Every night's a brand new night. We're only as good as your last flight at Eastern.
This Net Alert Special Report.
This is Reed Collins, CBS News in New York. Shots have been fired at President Reagan, who had just concluded a speech in a Washington hotel to a union meeting. The White House says the president was not hit. My colleague Lem Tucker is on the scene. Lem, you're in Washington. I don't know where, but what do you know and what did you see?
Reed, this is Lem Tucker. I am right across the street from the ballroom entrance of the Hilton Hotel. Ronald Reagan had just finished about a 30-minute speech to an AFL-CIO meeting. He was leaving through what we call in the press the presidential entrance. It was about a 30-foot walk to his car, less maybe. He turned to wave, and I believe a reporter called out Mr. Reagan. The crowd was mixed, not just press people, and suddenly we heard the pop, pop, pop. Oh, I know I heard at least 5 shots. The first thought, someone hollered firecrackers. And then we realized it was more than that. At this point, or at that point, Secret Servicemen did what they do so well. The reflexes went to work. They grabbed the president, literally threw him into the back seat of his limousine, and the motorcade sped away. They did get a man, we have to say at this point, believed to have been the assailant. So far, at last I could see, and I can see some of the activity from here. Perhaps you can hear the sirens as the ambulances come up and leave. 3 people have been wounded. 3 people were down on the ground by the ballroom entrance here. 1 man appeared to have sustained a head injury. 2 others, we could not ascertain where they were hit. A second ambulance now just pulling away. It appears that there is still 1 person on the ground. The man that they took away, and the man we have to say at this point only believed to be the assailant, was white, appeared to be in his late 30s or 40s, kind of sandy blonde hair. I did not get the best look at him. Our cameraman, who was on the scene, described it to me. And needless to say, utter shock and panic broke out here. At this point, yet another ambulance has just pulled up. There really is no more at this point, except to say that it is my understanding that the President of the United States was taken away from the scene, totally uninjured. By this time, I'm sure is back at the White House, and more information will be coming from there. But I repeat, there was no indication by those of us who were eyewitnesses to this scene that the president was hit. I'm not sure there is any such good thing as a 100% good, competent eyewitness to any sort of scene such as that, because the moment those pops of a pistol start, you naturally start shrinking back into building entrances a bit. But that is what we are fairly certain has happened.
Lem, let me recapitulate with you. This happened outside the hotel, the Washington Hilton.
Washington Hilton is one of 2 Hiltons here. It is a monster of a hotel, really huge. It's on Connecticut Avenue, for those who may know Washington. 3 or 4 blocks above DuPont Circle, a landmark here. There is, of course, the main entrance leading to the lobby. And then if you take a side street, there is the ballroom entrance. I think it may be Florida Avenue, I'm not sure. There is the ballroom entrance, and through which thousands of people pass every week as major conventions are held there. Well, just before you reach that entrance, there is a small door, an entranceway, which has been dubbed over the years, I'm told, the presidential entrance and exit. That allows security. You can take the president and his party in that way and out that way. They're on the street a minimum of time. They go down secure corridors. They go into the ballroom, as the president did this afternoon. On arriving there, the president was introduced. It was a meeting of the Building and Trades Council of the AFL-CIO. He got I would say, a warm reception. Had just concluded, and as we have other reporters or had other reporters inside, I had left early because I wanted to be outside to see him depart, maybe to ask him a question about Poland. And as I said, he was, if I had to count, I would guess he was 15 to 20 feet outside that door. He was 5 to 10, maybe 15 feet from the limousine when there's only one description for it, all hell broke loose.
Could you detect any reaction the president had, or did he have time to do it?
No, Reed, at that point, I'm afraid that I was not 100% your best eyewitness. I was aware of the president appearing to crouch. I'm not sure if that was his own reflex or if the agents, whose reflexes are usually very good in this type of situation, whether that was the agent starting to push and shove and jostle him. One of the things I have to say that became rather alarming to us is the press area was not what we call a secure area. Quite often in these things, they will put up a rope. They will say, okay, only press here. Secret Service and policemen will make sure that there are no civilians, shall we call them, in that area. But there were a lot of civilians in that area. There were civilians to my right, civilians to my left, and I would have to see the man that they say may have done this, to be sure. But I think he was standing no more than 2 people away from me against the wall, and I was very, very close to that wall. But we don't, all we know at this point is he appears to have gotten out of here, the president, totally unharmed. The assailants, alleged assailants, literally had about 10 policemen sitting on top of him at one point. Submachine guns, pistols, rifles. A police car was brought up. They had to tussle with him a bit to get him into the back seat of the car. And again, they left with what appeared to be a couple of policemen sitting on him as they drove away.
And the president, as we have it, was not hit. The president is uninjured. Shots were fired, though, at President Reagan this afternoon following a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel in front of the AFL-CIO Building Trades Union meeting. And again, the president was not hit, but 3 other people were injured. A lone white male has been taken into custody. It's believed the men wounded were Secret Service men and possibly Presidential Press Secretary James Brady. We say possibly. We'll be hearing more on this. But the president was pushed into his limousine and taken to safety, and again, he was not hit. So we appreciate that report from CBS News' Reed Collins and Lem Tucker at the Washington Hilton. It's 1:40. News as it happens, history as it happens here at WCCO, St. Paul, Minneapolis.
6.5 down 2 1/4. Kansas City may wait 435.5 down 1.
In New York, if you have not heard, shots were fired at President Ronald Reagan this afternoon as he left a speech in the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Mr. Reagan was not hit. He was not hurt. The White House has confirmed this. He was rushed into his limousine after the shots broke out, and he was taken on to the White House. The President of the United States is safe. However, several people were wounded in this fusillade of bullets, and we understand that one of them may have been the Presidential Press Secretary himself. Let's go now and find out more. My colleague Lem Tucker, who gave us this first report. Lem, do you know any more about this?
Reed, I just came back from the scene where a colleague of mine, a press colleague who was out there at the same time that I was, that the shooting took place, who stayed during some of the initial fracas, which I watched from a drugstore window across the street and described earlier. He tells me, and I couch this ever so carefully because we have no confirmation of this, he tells me that one of the people on the ground, the man to whom I referred earlier as appearing to have a head wound, was James Brady, who is the press secretary to the President of the United States. Mr. Brady certainly was close at the time Mr. Reagan was exiting the building. I have no other identification at this point on the other 2 bystanders, but one who were injured. One is thought to have been a hotel security agent. All 3 of the people who were injured and down on the sidewalk have been removed now by emergency vehicles to nearby hospitals. Once again, to tell you what went on here, not too long ago, the President of the United States had just completed a speech to several thousand members of the Building and Trades Council of the AFL-CIO, and was leaving through what is considered a secured exit, the presidential doors to the side of the main ballroom. He had just emerged from the Hilton Hotel. He waved. The crowd had built. There were civilians, shall we call them, mixed in with accredited press people, all wearing badges, the press people. He waved. Someone said, I heard his name used. I don't know if that was a colleague of mine about to ask a question or if it was a bystander getting his attention. The next thing we know, as the president lifted his arm to wave, the shots rang out. How many? Well, that we will have to leave for the experts. It seemed from where I was to have been at least 4 or 5. They came from very close to where I was standing. And seconds later, the police had surrounded a gentleman who appeared. And I caution that sometimes eyewitness reports at the time something like this is going on are not 100% totally accurate, but he appeared to be sort of sandy blonde, thought by some to be late 30s or 40s. He was wrestled to the ground. At least 8 or 10 agents appeared to be sitting on him as they had their weapons drawn, submachine guns, rifles, pistols. And the man was, in thinking back over this, they had him down on the ground at least in the almost the exact spot where I had been standing along with a colleague from ABC News and cameraman from all 3 of the networks. There were also civilians very close there. The scene now, and I am watching it from just across the street through windows of a drugstore, is mass bedlam with Secret Service agents and police roaming through the crowd questioning. Jim McManus was there for part of that, and here's my colleague Jim McManus.
The Secret Service right now are questioning a man, a bystander, who says that immediately after the shots were fired, he and 2 other men with him, companions of his apparently, saw a white male running from the scene carrying what they described as a black box. They did not say what size the box was. Neither the witness nor his 2 companions would identify themselves. There's no, at least at this juncture, no direct connection to the shooting, but 3 men who say right after the shots were fired, a man burst by them, running from the scene, carrying a black box. The witnesses will not identify themselves again. They apparently are concerned that if they are identified, that they might become vulnerable to attacks upon themselves. The crowd is standing around in the street, several hundred, held back by police. They're very quiet, curious, talking among themselves. But for those who believe they saw something here that might be of some consequence, are being very careful about what they say to reporters at this point. Most of the emergency vehicles have left. Helicopters have been flying overhead from the District of Columbia Police. And now we see an Army bus pulling up here that we cannot see who is in it. A rather large Army bus. Still a lot of police standing across the street just outside the entrance to the hotel. Reporters and cameramen now being pushed back inside a rope enclosure as the police try to get some order in the street. Those injured have been taken away from the scene, and there really at this point is not much else we can tell you.
Jim, let me say that the presidential spokesman Larry Speaks has confirmed that among the 3 people who were hit in the bullets was the White House press secretary James Brady. And his condition, along with the 2 others who were also wounded, is not known, of course, at this time. But as you know, Mr. Brady keeps pretty close tabs on the president. He's with him at all times. We've seen stories of Mr. Brady's attempting to protect the president from continued questioning, and he is virtually his shadow. Let's go now from the Hilton scene to the White House and our White House CBS News correspondent, Bill Plant.
All we've been told at the White House thus far is that the president was not, I repeat, not hit by the gunfire. We were told that 3 people were hit, 2 of them police officers, one a Secret Service agent, the other apparently, we're not certain, a Metropolitan Police officer, and we have seen that James Brady, the president's secretary, was hit. We've seen pictures already here at the White House. People have gathered back in Brady's office, very concerned, obviously. They've seen pictures of him lying bleeding on the ground. We know that his wife has been picked up by a car to go to the hospital. We were told that the president went to George Washington University Hospital here in Washington, D.C., with Jim Brady and the other 2 men who were hit. Thus far, that's all we know at the White House.
That's the scene as we get it from our colleagues Lem Tucker, Jim McManus outside the Washington Hilton Hotel, where shots were fired at President Reagan this afternoon. Mr. Reagan was not hit. He was hustled by the Secret Service into the safety of his limousine. At least 3 others, we are told, however, were wounded by these stray bullets, and one of them, it has been confirmed, is Mr. Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, who has been hospitalized. We're told that Mr. Reagan is with him now in George Washington University Hospital, which is just a few blocks from the White House. That is the information as we have it, as best we know it. We do know that a man is in custody, a presumed suspect in the attempt on the president's life, a man described as in his late 30s, early 40s, a sandy-haired, blondish-looking man who apparently wielded a pistol, fired several shots, wounded 3 people, missed the president, but did wound among those 3 James Brady, who is Mr. Reagan's White House press secretary. His condition, that of the others who were hit, we don't yet know. And that's all we do know for now. This is Reed Collins, CBS News, New York.
WCCO Radio News, this is Dick Chapman. Perhaps you've been following it. Several gunshots fired at President Reagan as he left the downtown Washington hotel something more than half an hour ago. Secret Service agents shoved the president into his armored limousine, which sped away from the Washington Hilton Hotel, but that left 3 men lying on the ground just a few feet from where the president had been standing. The president was not hit. The 3 men wounded included Presidential Press Secretary James S. Brady, and that's been confirmed by his deputy press secretary, Larry Speaks. Brady was taken to George Washington University Hospital. President Reagan, who is said to have suffered a bump in the chaos, accompanied him. Secret Service agents shoved the president into the armored limousine. The president had just delivered a speech to the AFL-CIO's Building Construction Trades Conference meeting at the hotel. Police grabbed a sandy-haired man who appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s. One reporter said he heard 5 shots. We hope to have more details in just about 2 minutes as we rejoin CBS News. Now this.
I hope you'll check in with me, David Hopp, your new late-night companion here on 830. We've got mellow music, news, sports, and weather information, plus some prizes for listening. 10:30 weeknights here on Clear Channel WCCO, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
CBS News. Shots have been fired at President Reagan, but the president was not hit. I'm Reed Collins reporting on the CBS radio network. Mr. Reagan had just finished a speech to a union group at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., and had walked outside when shots were heard. The president, as we have said, was not hit or hurt. 3 others were, however. One of these identified now as James Brady, President Reagan's press secretary, who along with the 2 others has been hospitalized. At the scene near the Washington Hilton is my colleague Lem Tucker.
Reed, I'm still right across the street. I'm looking out on the scene where this took place. Well, within the last 45 minutes, Mr. Reagan leaving, he, perhaps had 25 to 30 feet to walk to his car. He had just raised his arm to return a greeting, it appeared to me, and from what I heard, and the shots rang out. It sounded to me, and they came from very close in the vicinity where I was standing, it sounded like at least 4, it may have been more. Then the expected in that kind of situation, pandemonium broke out. and the police, the Secret Service agents, hotel security, literally pounced on the alleged assailant and were sitting on him. 3 people were wounded. We now know, as you said, one of them was James Brady. At this point, Secret Service agents, Washington policemen are going through the crowd trying to get any eyewitness accounts that they had. My colleague Jim McManus said earlier that police are questioning a person who says he believed he saw someone running away from the scene with a black box of sorts, which may indicate, again, may not, but may indicate that there was more than one person involved in this, if in fact the person they've taken away was the alleged assailant. The president was literally pushed into the limousine. Secret Service agents got in with him, and they took off, and as we have reported time and time again, the President of the United States is safe. That's the situation here at this point at the Washington Hilton.
Ronald Reagan today, just outside a hotel in which he had given a speech to a union group. Mr. Reagan was not hit. The Secret Service estimates, however, that from 4 to 6 bullets were fired. 3 persons were wounded. One of these, the presidential press secretary, James Brady, who appeared to have been hit in the head. He and the other 2 have been hospitalized. Mr. Reagan, who, as we say, was unscathed, was taken to the hospital to be in the company of his press secretary, who, according to word in the U.S. Senate and elsewhere, was seriously wounded by the bullets. The Secret Service has in custody a man that they believe was the assailant, who fired several shots from fairly close range just outside the VIP, or very important person, exitway from the Washington Hilton Hotel. My colleague Lem Tucker was not far from the scene, not far, in fact, from the place where people were being shot at, and we don't seem to have exact word here. I'm going to have to make sure exactly what's happening here. This is a different development from anything else we have seen. A secretary to the president, Lynn Nofsinger, is now quoted as having said that Mr. Reagan was hit by one of the bullets. He says, and we quote, that he was shot once in the left chest and is conscious. None of this goes with any of the other information that we have been transmitted, and we're not certain of the entire fitting of the pieces. We were told that Mr. Reagan was hustled into the limousine, that 3 others were hurt, but that's all we happen to know. Now the word from a White House official is that Mr. Reagan indeed was hit by one of these shots. In the left chest, he is described as conscious. There are no further details to this. We had known that Mr. Brady, the press secretary to the president, was hit. He appeared to have been struck in the head by a bullet, and he was in serious condition. But this late development, that the first word we had, that Mr. Reagan was simply hustled into his limousine unscathed, apparently was erroneous, perhaps purposely so, given the time that it takes to make some determination of his condition. Lem Tucker, does this come as a surprise to you, the word we get now from Lynn Nofsinger, that the president himself was indeed wounded?
A shock, Reed, because we have not had any eyewitness accounts of that. From what I saw, it didn't happen. A shock only in that we have been led to believe it didn't happen, both from what we think we saw and what others saw. However, not knowing the nature of this, whether he's talking about a grazing or what, I, for one, at this point, would not want to go farther in commenting, except to say that we did see him hustled in the car and taken away. My colleague, Jim McMahon, just a moment, I am getting more information.
Lem Tucker is
I am now, Reed,
get some
I
more.
am now hearing from, and let me state my source very clearly, photographers and reporters who normally cover the White House and are even close to some of the Reagan people, that the president may have been hit, and I'm hearing a report that he may very well be not at the White House as we were led to believe, but at a local hospital. Again, I think until we get something out of the White House, that I, for one, don't want to pursue that any further.
I don't either, except the word that we get is that Lynn Nofziger is the source for this, and he is a
pretty good source.
presidential aide, so there could be no question he would not be mistaken about this.
That's a pretty good source.
We now have a different vantage point, a different viewpoint. Let's switch now, Lem, to Nelson Benton.
Reed, I am at a store just across the street from George Washington Hospital, and Lynn Nofziger, who is a press aide to President Reagan, just told reporters about 5 minutes ago that the president is in the hospital. He was hit in the left chest. Nofziger said that his condition is stable. Nofziger said nothing more. He left reporters after telling them that. He said he had heard from other sources that 2 other people were wounded, but he commented only on the president. Repeating, Lynn Nofziger, a White House official, said that President Reagan was struck in the left chest. He is at George Washington Hospital in Midtown Washington, about 8 blocks from the White House. His condition is stable.
And that is the latest development. Approximately an hour ago, a series of shots was fired. We knew that 3 people were down on the ground. We identified one, and it has been identified by the White House officially as the presidential press secretary, James Brady. It was thought in the scene in which Mr. Reagan himself was hustled from the scene and into the limousine that he was not wounded. In fact, apparently, according to Lynn Nofziger, a presidential aide, Mr. Reagan was hit by one of those bullets, one of them in the left chest. He is described as conscious. He, too, has been taken to the hospital, where his condition is described by Mr. Nofziger as stable. Mr. Nofziger is not at the hospital. He, as Nelson Benton just reported, came out from the hospital to inform reporters who are gathered across the street from Washington University Hospital. That is several blocks from the White House itself. Mrs. Reagan, Nancy Reagan, has now joined her husband in the hospital. All we know is that the president was, in fact, wounded in the assassination attempt today, wounded in the left chest. It is presumed that the bullets were fired from a pistol of some caliber which we know not. A young man, or a man perhaps 38, 42, was taken into custody immediately, pounced upon. We don't know if a weapon was recovered. A suspect, is under arrest. He didn't get away from the scene. Mr. Reagan's wounding comes as a surprise because no one there thought that he was hit. He was moved so suddenly from the scene, hustled into the limousine. It is said, however, that as he had turned, apparently to answer a question shouted at him from a reporter, and as the shots were fired, that he appeared to be in shock and surprise. People in combat who know that people can actually be wounded. The original shock of bullet penetration is such that the individual subject doesn't always know it's happened until sometime later. And perhaps the force of the blow, the force of the Secret Service simply carried him on into the car, and no one saw the fact until it was just announced that President Reagan himself was hit by one of these bullets in the left chest. His condition is described by Lynn Nofziger, who's become the spokesman outside the hospital, as stable. Mr. Reagan, as we know, is 70. His condition physically is very good, according to all of the hospital reports, which will stand him well. He keeps in shape, rides horses, chops wood, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, and has taken good care of his life. And the hospital, George Washington University Hospital, now is charged with doing what he himself no longer can do. And we understand that his condition is officially described as stable. It was not said at first that the president was hit. In fact, it was said by presidential aides and White House aides that he was not hit, not hurt, and that, in fact, he had gone to the White House when he had indeed gone to the hospital itself. Then it was said he went to the hospital because his aide, Presidential Press Secretary James Brady, had been hit, and the president wanted to be with him, naturally. Now, some 1 hour after the incident took place, perhaps an hour and 5 minutes, we are getting the full picture, the full story of the event. Mr. Reagan was wounded, has been hit by a bullet in the left chest, is hospitalized along with the others, 3 of whom were wounded and left at the scene for a brief time until ambulances could be summoned. They're all apparently in the same hospital now. James Brady, seriously wounded, we are told, from a head wound. The presidential press secretary, who stands by the president, who keeps him, when he can, from responding continually to reporters' importunities, was hit in the head. The president was struck, as we say, in the left thorax. The exact medical terminology for his wounding has not been released. He was described, again by Lynn Knopfsinger, as conscious, and the hospital describes his condition as stable. Beyond that, nothing is known of the terror of the afternoon in which the president went to seek support from organized labor for his austerity economic program, made a speech to the AFL-CIO Building and Trades Council inside the Washington Hilton Hotel, spoke for about half an hour, then went to the VIP exit area, which gets him to the limousine without having to go through all of the lobby and out to Connecticut Avenue through the normal course of events. There was a semi-cordoned off area in which it was thought that mostly accredited newsmen would be. Someone else was there, someone apparently with a pistol. He opened fire, fired 4, perhaps 6 shots, no one seemed certain. It was said at first that Mr. Reagan was not hit, that he was spared it, but that 3 others, including the press secretary James Brady, were wounded. It was said that Mr. Reagan was going to the White House. Then it was said, no, he's gone to the hospital. It was said, however, he went to the hospital in order to be with Mr. Brady. Now we are informed officially that one of those bullets was fired into the left chest of the president. He is hospitalized in Washington University Hospital. His condition described as stable. Lynn Knopfsinger, one of his aides, says that he is also conscious. Mrs. Reagan is now in the hospital with him. And that is all that we can really tell you, because that is all that we know. A story that began on the bright note, the good news that the president had been missed, was missed. He was not missed, he was shot. He and 3 others, including his press aide, James Brady, whose condition has been described in the Senate at least as serious by Howard Baker, who made the announcement a short time ago. Mr. Reagan's condition is described as stable now. We are told that he is conscious, but he was wounded somewhere in the left chest by one of those 4 to 6 bullets fired at him a little more than an hour ago. We will, of course, keep you informed of any developments, and we will interrupt programming wherever necessary to follow the story of the attempt on the life of President Reagan, an attempt which did succeed inasmuch as he was wounded in the chest. This is Reed Collins, CBS News, New York.
Thank you, Reed. It's 22 after 2 o'clock. History as it happens here at WCCO Radio. So that's what we know so far, and we certainly will interrupt any and all programming to bring you more information. This is WCCO, St. Paul, Minneapolis at 830. Forecast for St. Paul, Minneapolis is calling for upper 30s to low 40s tonight. Possibility of showers, thunderstorms late, 40% chance.
Now from CBS News, this Net Alert special report.
I'm Reed Collins, CBS News, New York, where we have more word on the attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan this afternoon. It happened about an hour, 15 minutes ago in front of the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., Mr. Reagan was struck by one of several bullets that were fired. He and 3 other men were shot. He is apparently not seriously wounded, although the exact condition of himself is yet to be determined. He is in the hospital now, where he is said to be suffering a wound in the left chest. All of this information is being relayed to the outside world by the presidential press aide, Lynn Knopfsinger.
I can confirm that the president has been shot once in the left chest. The bullet entered from his left side. He is in stable condition. He is conscious. And Mrs. Reagan is with him. And at this moment, we have nothing further to say.
Mr. Knopfsinger did add, however, that the president was not in surgery, indicating that the bullet is lodged in his chest. He is said to be stable and, in fact, conscious. When the shots rang out, the assumption was that Mr. Reagan was simply rushed into the limousine by the Secret Service, and it was not believed that he was hit. It's believed that he himself took some time to realize this. One official is quoted as having said that the president walked into the hospital, didn't even have to be carried in. And as we say, it's believed that a bullet may be lodged in the chest of the president. His condition described as stable. His wife was rushed from the White House to the hospital, Washington University Hospital. She had not attended the speech with him that he delivered earlier today to a labor union meeting in the Washington Hilton Hotel. 3 others were wounded. One of these identified as the presidential press secretary, James Brady, who it's believed suffered a head wound and his condition may be serious. Another man believed wounded also is a policeman, and he has been reported in critical condition now. A Secret Service agent is said to be the 4th man who was struck by the fusillade of bullets. His condition is not known. But to sum up, President Reagan has been wounded in an assassination attempt that took place about an hour, 20 minutes ago. He has been wounded in the left chest. One version of this says that he walked into Washington University Hospital unassisted, didn't realize at first that he himself had been victimized by one of the gunman's bullets. A suspect has been arrested. He is described as a white man, about 38, maybe in his early 40s, sandy-haired. We have no name for him. We have no description of the weapon. We haven't even a description of its having been recovered. That is all presumption. Now, we do have an identification of the suspect. It is said that the suspect is identified as a man from Colorado. His name is given as John W. Hinckley of Evergreen, Colorado. This is the word that we have from Washington now, and we don't know any more about the man named John W. Hinckley, except that he, according to the Secret Service and the Metropolitan Police, is a suspect in the attempted assassination and, in fact, the wounding of the President of the United States. My colleague, CBS News correspondent Bill Platt, is at the White House.
Reed, the situation here is one of watchful waiting. We have gotten the same information that you have about the suspect, about the identification of the agent. A few moments ago, we were told that the President of the United States was hit in the left side of his chest and that his condition is stable, information which I think you reported. We're also told that he is conscious. We know that Mrs. Reagan left the White House shortly after the incident to go to George Washington University Hospital to be with the President. We have no word on the condition so far of Press Secretary James Brady, who appeared on the videotape to be hit in the head, and on the condition of the District of Columbia policeman, who was the other man injured. But the President, we're told, is in stable condition, and that he is conscious, that he has a single wound on the left side of his chest. We're waiting here for further details.
Bill, has there been any established procedure, any bulletin regularity? How is this thing going to be parceled out? Do you have any idea?
Well, the Assistant or Deputy Press Secretary, Larry Speaks, along with White House Chief of Staff Jim Baker and Presidential Counselor Edwin Meese, have all gone to George Washington University Hospital. There's an announcement being made here now. We're told that there will be a briefing here momentarily by David Gergen, who is Jim Baker's assistant. So I'll throw it back to you, and possibly we'll hear some of that.
All right. If something does come out of that, we'll go back to Bill Platt in just a moment. To repeat, a suspect in the attempted assassination of Mr. Reagan is now identified as a man from Evergreen, Colorado, whose name we are given as John W. Hinckley. His age is not listed. He was described by those at the scene outside the hotel as a man who could be in his late 30s or early 40s, sandy-haired. That's all that anybody seems to know of him. We don't know the nature of the weapon, the caliber. Presumably it was a pistol. The Secret Service thought 4 to 6 shots were fired from the gun. Mr. Reagan was not at first believed to have been hurt or hit. In fact, the White House took pains to say that he was not. However, it was discovered, once in the limousine at least, that he had a bullet wound in the chest. He walked into George Washington University Hospital, having been taken there in his own limousine, where we are told by Lynn Knopfsinger he is conscious and stable, and the plans for surgery to remove the bullet apparently have not been made. At least last we were told that he is not now in surgery, nor were there any plans to take him there. The condition of James Brady, the presidential press secretary, a portly man who is constantly at the president's side, is feared to be serious. It was obvious that he was struck in the head by one of these shots from the assailant's gun, and he lay on the sidewalk bleeding profusely for some time. He was taken to the same hospital as were two other men, one a policeman, one a Secret Service agent. The policeman's condition now is described as critical. The man was pounced upon, the alleged assailant, immediately by several Metropolitan policemen and agents of the Secret Service as well, and he did not leave the scene. We have no word from then on the recovery of a gun or any identification of what caliber it was, which of course would be important in the case of the wounded. How he got there, no one seems to know. It was believed that he had mingled in with a number of accredited press people just outside the exitway of the Washington Hilton Hotel, the so-called VIP entrance, through which people enter and egress without having to go all the way through the lobby. Mr. Reagan had spoken to the AFL-CIO Building and Trades Council for about half an hour. This was sort of the opening day of his personal campaign to attempt to get organized labor behind his economic austerity program. He received moderate response from what would normally be a fairly cool audience, one might say. Let's go back now to the White House briefing. Bill Plant is there, and we're being told more information.
One shot once in the left side this afternoon as he left the hotel. His condition is stable. A decision is now being made whether or not to operate to remove the bullet. The White House and the Vice President are in communication, and the Vice President is now en route to Washington. He is expected to arrive in the city this afternoon. Mrs. Reagan is currently with the President at the hospital. For your background, we anticipate that additional press statements will be forthcoming from the hospital site. I'd like to add two notes. We have been informed by Jim Baker that the President walked into the hospital. I would also like to inform you that in the building as of the moment are the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General, as well as other assistants to the President. No, in this building.
Do you have any condition on Jim Brady?
I'm sorry, we do not. We would like to get that for you as rapidly as possible.
Vice President act as President in these conditions?
No. Because of the delicacy of the situation, we wanted to inform you that the Vice President is on his way back to Washington. I would emphasize once again that the President's condition is stable, and that we were informed by Jim Baker that he did walk into the hospital.
But he was hit by a ricochet. Is there any chance he was hit?
I'm sorry, we simply don't have enough information that is hard at this moment to give you. I'm sorry, I do not know the information on that, so I'm really not able to respond. Let me say this. Let me just emphasize this for your background. The folks at the hospital are obviously closer to this situation on a moment-to-moment basis than we are here. We are obviously in very close communication with them, and we will try to keep you informed here, but that the primary statements we expect will be coming from the hospital, because we feel that they are closer to the facts.
Who is there, Dave, at the hospital?
Well, as of the moment, in addition to Mrs. Reagan, as I've informed you, and others, Mike Deaver, and as you know, and Dave Fisher were with the President at the time. 4 people went up together. Ed Meese, Jim Baker, and Larry Speaks and Lynn Knopfsiger went together to the hospital. Oh, I'm not sure of the time. The time on these events has run together somewhat. But we will try to keep you posted here as well as we can. I think you all understand the delicacy of the situation. I simply don't want to report facts that we're uncertain of as of the moment. This is really to confirm what has been said from the hospital already.
David, do you know whether there's any plan to move the President to Bethesda or Walter Reed or the
I cannot answer either of those questions. We will, as soon as we get additional information, we will obviously try to help you. I think if you will be patient as the situation demands, we will try to get as much information for you as possible.
Dave, is the President under any sedation?
I cannot answer that. I really would like, we wanted to let you know where we were as of the moment. We will try to let you have further information as we can. Thank you very much.
That was David Gerken. He's a deputy chief of staff of the White House staff, trying to describe to reporters in the White House what's happened several blocks away at George Washington University Hospital, where President Ronald Reagan is suffering a gunshot wound, a bullet wound in the left chest. He was said to be conscious. In fact, James Baker, his aide, informs people that he walked into the hospital, not having realized at first that he had in fact been struck by one of the several bullets that were fired this afternoon about an hour and a half ago, just outside the exitway of the hotel in which the president had delivered a speech. It was known, it was obvious to all who were there that 3 people were badly wounded, or at least knocked down by the bullets. One of these, James Brady, who now we are told is the president's press secretary, in case you didn't know, who is now in a scanning room in the hospital, an attempt being made to ascertain the seriousness of a bullet wound to the head. Another man, the Secret Service man who is wounded, has been identified tentatively as Timothy J. McCarthy. There is another man, again a police officer, a District of Columbia officer, apparently worse off than McCarthy is, whose name is not known, and he is said to be in critical condition. The suspect has been identified as a man from Evergreen, Colorado, whose name is John W. Hinckley. We don't know his age. We don't know his background. We do know that he's described as a white, sandy-haired fellow who was wearing a raincoat, a blue shirt, and dark trousers when this event took place. He was pounced upon, arrested immediately at the scene, and is in custody. There's no mention of any conspiracy, no mention of anybody else having been involved in any of this. To repeat, Mr. Reagan was struck by one of several bullets fired in his direction as he left the Washington, D.C. hotel this afternoon. He was struck in the left chest, apparently an entry wound in the front. The bullet apparently lodged in the chest, but he was not aware at first he had been struck. He was hustled into his limousine by the Secret Service. It went directly to the hospital, where we're told he walked into the hospital with the wound as it is. And he's described as conscious at one point and in stable condition, according to the hospital. Mrs. Reagan has now joined him there. So we have the 3 wounded people that we knew about at first and a wounded president, all in the same hospital, all stemming from one fusillade of bullets, 4 to 6 shots, we're told, having been fired. A suspect arrested immediately. His identity, John W. Hinckley, we're told, of Evergreen, Colorado, background unknown. Mr. Reagan is 70 years of age, as we know. His birthday, February 6th. He just celebrated the birthday after his inauguration. A man in good shape, who keeps himself that way, rides horses. We all saw him in his riding breeches just the other day. Chops wood when he can, gets out to California, spends a lot of time in the open and the outdoors, takes good care of himself, good personal habits, takes a little nap in the afternoon, doesn't get up at any back-breaking hour, but takes good care of himself, has a staff that does yeoman work for him, has a vice president in his mid-50s, George Bush, who's returning to the scene of the Capitol now. The other members of the cabinet have gathered, including the Secretary of State and the Attorney General at the hospital. This is necessary, of course, to coordinate what has to be done minute by minute in the running of the biggest government in this world. The president, wounded today, he apparently walked into the hospital unassisted, not having realized at first that he had been shot, having seen 3 others go down, a Secret Service man, a District of Columbia policeman, and his own press secretary, James Brady, who we believe was seriously hurt as he was wounded in the head. The age of the suspect now, according to the Secret Service, is given as 22 years of age, and the revolver is described now as a .38 caliber weapon. Let's go now to my colleague, our CBS News White House correspondent, Neil Strasser. Neil.
Reed, as you can imagine, it's a scene of great confusion at the White House. This happened to be a day off for me. I heard this news at lunch and ran into the White House, still without tie. And, of course, one of the people reported wounded is the press secretary. And so a lot of other people are doing the speaking right now. The deputy press secretary, Larry Speaks, has gone to the hospital. A lot of the word is being relayed from him, and you just put on the air David Gergen, the deputy chief of staff, telling us what is known here. And that word is much the same that's coming out of the hospital. The president was wounded. His condition is stable, shot in the left side. And you notice that Gergen told us that at this point, the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and Defense, and the Attorney General are all in the White House. And Gergen spoke once of the delicacy of the situation. Every impression we get is that the president's wound is not serious, but obviously all the wheels are being cranked up in case it may be. And of course, the vice president is being rushed back from Texas, been told to return. In fact, I think he began to return even before word spread that the president was shot. I don't believe it became known until he was on the way to the hospital in the limousine, and that he even realized that he'd been hit by that bullet. But our word is very sketchy at this point, a scene of great confusion, and it's very hard to add very much to the story from here, Reed.
Well, thank you, Neil. When these things happen, there is always a welter of confusion at the outset. Perhaps the most remarkable, confusing thing about this was a White House attributed announcement to the effect at first that Mr. Reagan was not hit and not hurt. And this was emphasized in the first reports. It was not to believe that he was, and perhaps to believe Lynn Nofziger. He himself didn't know he was until the realization struck him later that, in fact, there was a bullet wound in his chest. There's a heavy rain falling in Washington, as there is across some of the eastern seaboard, and this adds to the dour aspects of the streets in Washington being cordoned off now, the police trying to find the last smidgen of detail, if it indeed exists out there somewhere. So we don't know exactly what to tell you, except that bulletins will be issued from the hospital. David Gergen explained that the White House is not at the scene, and the hospital itself will probably tell us more about the condition of the president, of his press aide, and of the two other men that we know to have been struck by bullets this afternoon.
Reed Collins, CBS Radio News. This is Dan Hertzgaard along with Rich Holter in the WCCO Radio News room, and with us is Senator Rudy Boschwitz in Washington. Rudy, are you still with us?
We'll be right on, just 1 minute.
All right, thank you. We'll await him. Rich, we've had a lot of surprises
well, at least,
this afternoon.
We seem to know where we are now a little bit better, Dan, than we did 10 minutes ago. We know where the president was hit. We know what type of wound it was. We know that they are considering surgery at this point. They're trying to decide whether that's the right thing to do. The most interesting thing of all the facts we just heard, I find, is that the president walked into the hospital under his own power. And I think that brings very much into question exactly when he realized he was wounded. As you said before, I cannot believe that they would have allowed him to walk in had the people around him known that he had been injured.
Well, we know it's a .38 caliber. We don't know what kind of handgun it was, whether it was a revolver or a pistol, but at least we found that much out. And the assailant, the alleged assailant, that of John W. Hinckley, Jr. of Evergreen, Colorado. He is 22 years of age.
22 years of age.
Senator Boschwitz, are you with us?
Yes.
Good afternoon.
I can't imagine why they went to the hospital if they didn't know he was injured, on the other hand.
We had an understanding that that they went there because of the press secretaries being injured and suffering a head wound. New Secretary James Brady.
The secretary was not in the president's court.
Uh-huh.
No, but it was the president's desire to go to the hospital to see his press secretary. That was the understanding we had earlier. But I just can't find it difficult to believe that they would allow the president, a 70-year-old man, to walk into the hospital with a bullet wound had they known it was there.
Yes. Well, that .38 caliber, I don't know the difference. You said a pistol or a, what did you say?
Or a revolver.
What's the difference?
Well, there would be considerable difference. Most pistols of a .38 caliber would probably be considerably less in power and also bullet size and weight than, say, for example, a .38 Special, which would be a revolver caliber and also a common one used by police forces.
That's a big machine, a .38. A .38, isn't it?
Certainly enough to do considerable damage. Many police forces around the country use the .38 Special.
Right.
What is the reaction, Senator Boschwitz, in Washington, to your understanding to this point?
Well, I called the cloakroom, and I must say the Republican cloakroom, there were a number of senators sitting there, and it was absolute silence. There's just a feeling of shock here, of course, that this new president, who is just getting going and has been shot, it's just remarkable. It takes my breath away. It really does. I don't know exactly how to react. You know that
one has to react with some sadness, but just to be very lucky that the president apparently is going to be okay. I don't know what stable condition means. That means he's not getting worse. It may mean he's not getting better, but if he walked into the hospital, and furthermore, if he didn't know that he was wounded even, that's certainly a very good sign. But how can a man be wounded and have the bullet lodged in his chest somewhere and not know it?
Well, there must have been a considerable amount of stress at the time, and it's hard to know. But we've been told, and it's been discussed, that can happen to people. As Deputy Chief of Staff David Gerken mentioned a little bit earlier, it is a very delicate situation, and it's very easy to get the wrong facts at times. And so, at this point, we really don't have all the answers yet.
Well, as long as he walked into the hospital, which is a visible act, one would think that that's a very positive sign.
Senator, what has the Senate done? Have they adjourned for the day?
I'm not sure.
I thought I saw some indication that the Senate, Dick Chapman is shaking his head. Yes, they have adjourned for the rest of the day.
We have adjourned?
That's correct, Senator.
It says that we're in session. Hold on just a minute. Let's find out.
We're in recess, subject to call of the chair.
So the Senate has recessed for the day. I presume the House will do the same, but you haven't heard anything along those lines, Senator.
He's off the line.
He's off the line now. Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you very much. Pass our thanks along to the Senator, and we'll talk to him later.
We are on recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Okay,
so
Senator.
We're just in recess.
All right, Senator, we thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Yes, and I'm sure that your listeners share the shock that I have. Just don't know how to react, to be honest with you, and just have to be prayerful that the president recovers. It looks like he will.
Well, we certainly hope so. Thank you very much, Senator Rudy Boschwitz. The words stable, the official condition of the president, stable. There was discussion that the bullet did enter in the left chest area under the arm somewhere, Rich.
And they're now considering whether or not surgery is the thing to do at this time.
The bullet is still lodged inside.
As far as we know, the president's body does still hold the bullet, and they're trying to decide whether or not surgery is called for. The vice president, as indicated on CBS, is on his way back to Washington from Texas. And the president, we will be hearing more about the president's condition, we're told, from the officials at George Washington University Hospital. And I guess that's about it for now, Dan. We'll add more, of course, as it comes in.
All right. Just a quick recap on the condition of the other three. James Brady, press secretary, suffered a bullet wound in the head. He is undergoing scanning at this time. No doubt a very serious injury. We'll hear more about that, as well as a policeman and Tim McCarthy, who is listed in serious condition. So there were 3 other injuries as well. The news is next. It's 5 minutes to 3 at WCCO Radio 48 in St. Paul, Minneapolis.
WCCO Radio News, this is Dick Chapman. I've just been informed that Senator Durenberger is on the line from Washington. Let me see if I can find the right phone. Senator Durenberger? Wrong phone. We'll try to get him on another line. Just picking up bits and pieces of information that come in. This is a little bit more than we had heard earlier from the scene of the shooting. A television cameraman near the assailant said Brady was shot in the forehead. That's the press secretary. And then he added, the gunman just opened up and started firing about 10 feet from President Reagan. The cameraman said he saw a white man with blonde hair in his 30s fire at Reagan from about 10 feet away with a .38 caliber pistol. Quoting again, he just opened up and continued squeezing the trigger. He said the assailant did not say anything. Brown said the man appeared to have penetrated the press corps. Now it's my understanding that Senator Durenberger has reached us from Washington. Are you there, Senator?
Yes, I am, Dick.
This is Dick Chapman. I just wonder, this must be quite a shock to the Senate and the whole Capitol.
Well, it's a different kind of shock, I guess, from the last time that I can recall this happening to me when President Kennedy was killed. I'm standing on the floor of the Senate in the middle of a debate on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and all of a sudden, you get a sudden sense of reality and, I suppose, futility about the things that are very passing in life, and it's quite a shock.
I understand the Senate is in recess right now, and at the subject of the call of the chair, it would be my guess, and you tell me if I'm correct or not, probably business would be suspended for quite some time until things clear up.
Well, I think that'll be the case. While we are in recess, I would imagine that now that it's known that the president has been injured, there's no question but what we aren't going to go back to the business of the Senate while we're concerned about the president.
Senator, does this sort of thing usually launch an immediate all-out investigation into the possibility of conspiracies, other people involved? What happens to the nation's capital? It just gets clamped down tight?
Well, I can't speak to what normally happens because I think this is the first time that it's happened in the nation's capital. And in other situations, of course, there's a concern relative to the complicity of others. But at least in my memory of these situations, we have Bobby Kennedy and George Wallace, and there was an attempt on Jimmy Carter here 2-3 years ago. It always turns out that it's a single individual possessed of some strange desire for fame or notoriety or something, and yet I suppose you have to take the time and make the effort to determine whether others were involved.
Thank you very much for taking your time, Senator.
Thank you,
Let's
Dick.
get back to your business in hand. Senator David Durenberger from Washington, repeating. The president has been wounded. An assailant fired 4 to 6 shots just outside a Washington hotel as the president emerged from having given a speech. Arrested and under custody of the Secret Service is a man identified as 22-year-old John W. Hinckley of Evergreen, Colorado. He is the suspect in the shooting of several people, including the wounding of the president. Known to be hit by the assailant was the presidential press secretary, James Brady, apparently suffering a head wound. The Secret Service man has been identified as Timothy J. McCarthy, his condition not known, and an unidentified Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Policeman is listed as in critical condition. The president's wound was described as being in the left chest area. A more detailed early description indicated the bullet had entered the president's body beneath the left arm, missing the heart area completely, and we've since been informed that the bullet is still in the president and they're still making a determination as to whether to attempt surgery. We expect to have much more information coming up very shortly on CBS. In the Twin Cities right now, we have a northwest wind at 5 miles per hour. The relative humidity 71%. Our Twin City temperature is 8 degrees Celsius, 46 Fahrenheit, and the humidity 71%. This is Dick Chapman, WCCO Radio News.
News. President Reagan has been wounded in an assassination attempt in Washington, but his spokesman Lynn Nofziger says he is conscious in stable condition at George Washington University Hospital, and Mrs. Reagan is with him. I'm Stephanie Shelton reporting on the CBS Radio Network. The president sustained a chest wound in the left chest. The bullet is still in Mr. Reagan's chest, and doctors say he will have to undergo surgery to have it removed. Mr. Reagan had been speaking at a labor convention at a Washington hotel, had just left, and was about 15 feet from his car when the shots broke out. More now from Bill Plant.
The president's top aides, Lynn Nofziger, Edwin Meese, Michael Deaver, James Baker, all at George Washington University Hospital with him. A few minutes ago, Staff Director David Gergen gave this report to reporters in the White House press room just a few minutes ago.
The president was shot once in the left side this afternoon as he left the hotel. His condition is stable. A decision is now being made whether or not to operate to remove the bullet.
We have now heard in an unconfirmed report that the president is in surgery. CBS News in Los Angeles has been told by his brother Neil Reagan that he is in surgery. We understand that he is in the hands of the thoracic surgery unit at George Washington Hospital. Vice President Bush is on his way back to Washington, D.C. from an out-of-town trip. Staff Director Gergen told us a few moments ago that the Vice President would not, I repeat, not be acting as President, at least not yet. That decision has not been made. Here in the White House now are the Secretaries of State, Treasury, Defense, and the Attorney General. Mrs. Reagan is at her husband's side in the hospital. Bill Plant, CBS News at the White House.
For further details, we go now to the George Washington University Hospital and to correspondent Nelson Benton.
Reporters have been standing in a driving rain outside George Washington Hospital since the president arrived and have been briefed twice, once by press aide Len Nofziger, the second time by another press aide, Larry Speaks. The combination of those two briefings are that the president was hit in the left chest, that he is in stable condition. Larry Speaks confirmed that Press Secretary James Brady was also hit. He would not comment on Brady's condition. Speaks was asked whether or not President Reagan has been scheduled for surgery. He would not comment. Then when he was asked, was he in surgery, Speaks would not comment on that either. Nelson Benton, CBS News at George Washington Hospital in Washington.
We have heard now that the president is in surgery, and we have a late report from correspondent Phil Jones who says that the president has received at least one transfusion. So to recap briefly now, what we know, President Reagan was wounded in an assassination attempt in the left chest. The bullet remained lodged in his chest. He has been taken into surgery, and he has already received one transfusion. This report from our correspondent on the scene, Phil Jones. Now let us tell you what we know about some of the circumstances surrounding this. The shots erupted, 4 to 6 of them, according to the Secret Service, as Mr. Reagan was leaving through the VIP exit from a Washington hotel after delivering a speech to a building trades union convention. Mr. Reagan's news secretary, James Brady, was also shot. He was shot in the head, apparently seriously. A Secret Serviceman, Timothy McCarthy, was hit, and so was a Washington police officer. That officer, so far unidentified, said to be in critical condition. In custody, one suspect, whom the Secret Service identifies as John W. Hinckley, 22 years old, from Colorado, white, sandy-haired, according to those who witnessed the shooting. The revolver, says the service, is a .38 caliber revolver. The cabinet members have been assembled at the White House. Secretary of State Haig, the vice president, is on his way back from Texas, but there has been no decision, according to Bill Plant, that he is to assume office as president or as acting president at the moment. We do have a report and a reaction from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Britain. She heard the news of the shooting of the president, and she issued a statement from 10 Downing Street. Tony Brunton has a report on that from London.
Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher heard the news at number 10 Downing Street sometime within the last hour, and she immediately sent a message to President Reagan. In this message, just released, she said she was shocked to hear of the assassination attempt. She was, she put it, very distressed to learn of the injuries and the wounding, and she prayed that his injuries were not serious, she said. And she also said her thoughts were with Mrs. Reagan and the rest of the family. And finally, this message from Downing Street continues. She says her sympathy goes to members of the staff who were wounded or hit. Tony Broughton, CBS News, London.
Continuing our coverage now of the attempted assassination of President Reagan, the shooting of President Reagan, we go now to my colleague Reed Collins, who's been keeping track of it all. Reed?
Like you, I have been trying to keep track of it all. It's one of those confusing afternoons that began with what was good news if you were the president, because the White House said at first that he was not hit and was not hurt. In fact, the first word we got was that he was being taken in his limousine back to the White House from the scene of the shooting at the hotel on Constitution Avenue. Then, sometime later, the word came from Lynn Nofziger, one of the president's press aides who's been in and out of his campaign life, to the effect that the president had in fact been shot, which came as shocking news to those who were seeking some relief from the horror of the day by the fact that Mr. Reagan, at least, had been missed. So now we know that he has been wounded in the left thorax, a bullet apparently lodged in his chest. We are told by some that surgery is inevitable, that he has had a transfusion, and that his condition remains nonetheless stable. We are also told that he has walked into the hospital and that he himself did not realize that he'd become a victim of the assailant's bullets until sometime after it happened. We have a late report now to the effect from correspondent Phil Jones. The president has undergone some surgery, and has at least received one transfusion, which of course is probably a normal course of events in such a case. James Brady, you, Stephanie, were on the campaign with them for some time. A rather stout fellow who seems to be with the president at all times has tried to dissuade him from answering all of the questions that the press corps keeps putting to Mr. Reagan, and Mr. Reagan keeps responding, and it's Mr. Brady who's become a familiar figure in trying to move him along. So he was close to the president, and it probably comes as no surprise to the White House News Corps that, in fact, he was in the line of fire.
Reed, I might tell you a little bit about James Brady, the White House News Secretary, and as you say, I did get to know him quite well on the Reagan campaign. He's generally a jolly fellow. He's 40 years old, a latecomer to Mr. Reagan's presidential campaign. He joined the effort after his first choice, former Texas Governor John Connally, dropped out of the race. Brady is from Centralia, Illinois. He was a public relations executive in Chicago before he entered politics. He worked in the Gerald Ford administration and as an assistant to the Secretaries of Housing and Defense. And during last fall's campaign, Brady was the deputy to the then press secretary, Lynn Nofsinger. Nofsinger is now a White House assistant, and Brady was brought into the Reagan camp after the candidate was criticized for making misstatements of fact while on the campaign trail. And it was Brady's job to keep Ronald Reagan up to date on all the issues. Brady was known on the campaign trail for his ability to deflect tough questioning from all of us reporters with his wit. Reed?
We're told that Mr. Brady was wheeled into a room in the hospital where they have a so-called CAT scanner device. It's sort of a super X-ray machine. He did not appear to be moving at the time. One of the other wounded men is a Secret Service agent. His condition is not known or not listed, but another of the wounded was a Washington District policeman. His condition described as critical. The president's younger son, who's the dancer with the Joffrey Ballet, got word of the assassination attempt this afternoon at a hotel in Lincoln, Nebraska, where the ballet was scheduled to perform this evening. He's Ronald Prescott Reagan. He's 23. Reporters watch the Secret Service agents briefing him. It is believed that the younger Reagan will leave Nebraska and head east as soon as that becomes possible by plane. Mrs. Reagan is at the hospital, as we have repeatedly told you. There has been no comment from her, no indication of what she is doing. The president, as we have said, is wounded but was ambulatory, according to James Baker, who said he walked into the hospital. No one at the scene of the crime had any inkling that Mr. Reagan had in fact been hit. He was rushed suddenly. He looked surprised and shocked by the Secret Service into the limousine, and it sped away. Everybody thought he's safe. He's going to the White House. So little we know when you have an event of that nature taking place. You have some of the crack reporters in all of the world gathered several feet away, and trying to find out from an eyewitness what happens is almost impossible until all the facts are sorted out.
Reed, we have this word in that Senate Republican leader Howard Baker has adjourned the Senate, which had been considering the Reagan package of tax cuts. Senator Edward Kennedy, whose two brothers were slain, of course, in the 1960s, the president and the then Attorney General, declared, "With our prayers for those who have been wounded, I think must go our resolution to rid our society of hatred. Violence and hatred are alien to everything this country
throughout. Lynn Nofsiger's at the hospital. He will be making statements from there. We will have the same information here. I can only say what we said earlier, that the president has a gunshot wound in the left side of the chest. He is in stable condition. Jim Brady has been shot. It is a head wound. We have no information on his condition. And that's the extent. I can't say.
Well, we have gotten confirmed reports, so have other network news, so have the wires. Can't you help us with that, Larry?
As soon as we can confirm it, we will. And
Larry, his brother's been called by the White House and has been told that the president is in surgery right now, that he's already had blood transfusions. Is your information going to be that far behind what we're getting from other sources?
No, Leslie, we will do our very best. Earlier, when I was out here, our initial reports was that the president was not hit. That's what we run into when we try to give information when we aren't 100% sure or we don't have from the source. We do have somebody there with the president. I will be here, and I just want to let you know I'll come down every 15 or 20 or 30 minutes just to let you know exactly what we know, and we'll also let you know when we don't have any further information.
What you know, what you just said now, is that the extent of what you know?
That's the extent of what I can say at this time.
The surgery and come back.
Phone call or something?
I will. Sure. No.
Do you have any idea, there are reports that it functioned to its lungs?
We can't confirm that yet. We've talked to the doctors, but, we cannot confirm that yet.
What process? Larry, can you confirm reports that Jim is in surgery now?
Yes.
What process does the United States government go through with foreign governments when something like this occurs?
Jerry, there is a notification process, and I think the State Department has moved on that.
The U.S. military been placed on any higher readiness?
Not that I'm aware of. There were some questions about the Vice President. I understand he was in Texas today. He is returning. He's expected to arrive at Andrews around 8 o'clock this evening, according to the information I have now. He has been informed. He is in communication.
Question about
powers?
No.
Can it be a division of labor of any kind?
Not that I'm aware of. We just haven't crossed those bridges yet.
What's the nature of the notification that the State Department is making to foreign governments?
I'm sure it's a notification to indicate that the president is in stable condition.
Larry, who's running the government right now?
If the president goes into surgery and goes under anesthesia, the Vice President Bush become the acting president at that moment, or under what circumstances does he?
I cannot answer that question, which is technical and legal.
What about the crisis management team? Does that come into effect?
Larry, what is the consideration in not keeping us more up to date on the president's condition? We know he's in surgery, and no one seems to be able to come out and confirm it. Why the time lag?
Leslie, I would assure you there's no reason except we want to be completely sure of our facts.
What sources are confirming it?
Well, I'm sorry, I cannot do it from here at this time.
What can you tell us about the gunman who's in custody?
Absolutely nothing. That would have to come from the Secret Service or the police.
Larry, who will be determining the status of the president and whether the vice president should in fact become the acting president?
Pardon?
Who will be determining the status of the president?
I don't know the details on that. I'll let you know shortly.
That was the Deputy White House Press Secretary, Larry Speaks, and this is Neil Strasser at the White House. Speaks has been at George Washington University Hospital, has been covering the events from there, came back here. There was obviously something of a time gap in his trip back here. He was unable to confirm those reports. He came by way of President's brother, Neil Reagan. Mr. Reagan is in surgery. Speaks did tell us that the Press Secretary, James Brady, is concerned.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to touch upon a few matters
Alexander Hayes,
associated with today's tragedy. First, as you know, we're in close touch with the Vice President, who is returning to Washington. We have in the Situation Room all of the officials of the Cabinet who should be here and ready at this time. We have informed our friends abroad of the situation, the President's condition as we know it, stable, now undergoing surgery, and there are absolutely no alert measures that are necessary at this time or contemplated. Now, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Management, would that be put into effect when he arrives?
Crisis management is in effect.
Who is making the decisions for the government right now? Who's making the decisions?
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State in that order. And should the President decide he wants to transfer the helm to the Vice President, he will do so. As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the Vice President, and in close touch with him. If something came up, I would check with him, of course.
What is the extent of the president's injury?
Well, as best we know, he's had one round into his body, in the left side, into the left lung, and there is a surgery underway to remove the round now. When the president entered surgery, he was conscious. All his signs were stable, and the the situation is very clear.
Why did they converse surgery? By phone? Before surgery?
No, I did not. Nor was it necessary. I was in close touch with both Mr. Meese and Mr. Baker throughout, and have been from the early moments.
Approximately when did you arrive at the White House?
Very few moments after the incident. Very few moments after the incident.
And do you know what is the condition, Mr. Brady?
We understand that I just saw on television what you saw, and it sounds serious.
What's the reaction of the Soviets to this?
I don't anticipate any reaction. I think you've gotten all that you need for the moment, and thank you.
Will you remain in charge here until the Vice President?
We'll stay right where we are until the situation clarifies.
When does the Vice President expect this surgery, sir? When does the Vice President expect it here?
Later this afternoon. He'll be here shortly.
When the operation began, sir, on the President, about what time?
Was I here? Yes, I was here.
What time?
What time the operation began? What time was the operation?
I don't know. Just it was shortly after that announcement that you heard on the radio, on television.
Vice President be back, sir?
Early evening. Well, I'm not going to make it a habit of saying where. He'll be back.
Will you come back and talk to us soon?
Thank you. If it's necessary, of course.
Any additional measures being taken? Was there a conspiracy, or was this an act?
There are no indications of anything like that now, and we are not going to say a word on that subject until the situation clarifies, of course.
From what you know of the President's condition, that the Vice President will have to, for a period of time, take the role of acting President?
That's a fundamentally premature question, and I couldn't answer it. Thank you very much.
That was the Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, who appeared very suddenly in the briefing room here at the White House, along with the man who did not speak, the National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, was standing by his side. As Allen spoke in a voice that was obviously very shaken. Allen telling us that, speaking of the tragedy of today, telling us, confirming that the President is in surgery, that the bullet wound that he suffered involved the left lung. We heard earlier that the bullet was still inside. The surgery is obviously to remove the bullet and repair whatever damage there may have been. So we hear from, from the Secretary of State that the President is in surgery. The Secretary of State, in effect, is the man in charge right now. Constitutionally, as he told us, it runs from the President to the Vice President to the Secretary of State, that line of succession. The President is in the hospital, presumably under anesthesia right now. The Vice President is flying back from Texas. He's making a speech there today, and so the Secretary of State is at the White House and is in charge, and has just appeared, in effect, to tell us that, to say that he sees no indication at this point of a conspiracy, sees no need either of any kind of alert measures, but to tell us that the government is still in good hands, so to speak, while the President is undergoing this surgery. Mr. Haig, unable to tell us either precisely what the President's condition is, but telling us that the bullet wound was more than a graze, as some had first thought after it was learned that he was hit by the bullet at all, that he did receive a bullet in the left lung, is now undergoing surgery. And Mr. Haig also telling us that the condition of James Brady appears serious. Brady, we understand, also undergoing surgery at this point. Brady, the White House News Secretary. Reed, that's as much as we know right now. It's obvious we're going to be kept much better informed from now on, now that things have gotten organized a bit, and we'll be here.
All right. Thank you, Neil Strasser at the White House. We should say that the Vice President, George Bush, was in Fort Worth, Texas, where he was en route to Austin to make his speech. He was informed by the Secret Service of the events in Washington. He now is on his way back to Washington, having made a brief stop in Austin, Texas. And we have a report from Frankie Rodriguez of station KLBJ in Austin.
Vice President Bush arrived here in Austin, according to Airport Tower people, about 2:18 Central Time. According to the people at the airport, he stayed in the plane while it was refueling. He had already received message that he would be routed to Washington from Austin. He was scheduled to make a press conference appearance at 3 o'clock Central Time and then speak to the joint session of the Texas legislature. However, upon his arrival, they simply pulled up to the terminal, refueled, and Vice President Bush and Air Force Two left about 3:08 Central Time, headed back to Washington. During that time, He met with Governor Bill Clements of Texas, who was accompanied by his wife. They met aboard Air Force Two.
That's the situation with respect to the Vice President's travel plans. He's expected in Washington, D.C. at Andrews Air Force Base early this evening, and he will, of course, receive in-air briefings as to the situation and as it pertains to the presidency. It is a constitutional and legal question as to whether or when or if Mr. Bush takes the reins of the presidency. That will depend, of course, on the condition of Mr. Reagan, who, as we have learned from Secretary of State Haig and from others, has or is undergoing surgery at George Washington University Hospital for the removal of a .38 caliber bullet which lodged somewhere in his left thorax, in his chest, grazed a lung. He's had a transfusion. We have been informed by reliable sources. His condition was stable when he entered the hospital. It is said that he, not having known immediately he was wounded, walked into the hospital, and there he underwent brief examinations, and he was taken to surgery. The damage to the track of the bullet and the removal of the excision of the bullet itself, of course, may take an undetermined amount of time. Mr. Reagan's 70 years of age, but as we have said before and has been said and commented upon previously, he keeps himself in good condition, takes good care of himself, and is an athletic and active president at the age of 70. The scene itself was confused by the rain and by the fact that nobody knew what was going on at first. Several bullets were fired as Mr. Reagan left a hotel where he'd given a speech. It was known that 3 people immediately had been felled, one of whom was his press secretary, James Brady, who was wounded in the head, we believe, and his condition is thought to be very serious. 2 others who were wounded were a Treasury Secret Service agent and a District of Columbia policeman whose condition is described as critical. It was thought that the president, in fact, it was said by the White House that the president had been missed and was not hit or hurt. And this was information that the news media went with for the better part of 1 hour, when suddenly it was discovered he was not at the White House, where it was thought his limousine had returned him, but in fact had been taken to the hospital too, wounded with a bullet lodged in the chest. Reaction has come, as we've noted, from London. We had a report from Anthony Brunton on the reaction and the statement by Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. Our correspondent, Walter Cronkite, happens to be in Moscow at the moment. And Walter, perhaps we can get to what Moscow thinks of the felling of its main Western adversary.
Well, Reed, it's midnight here just about now. In fact, it's 25 minutes after midnight. When the news came first rattling over the teleprinters of the American News Service wires here at the CBS Bureau.
That is all we're going to hear from Walter Cronkite in Moscow for the moment. As you could probably hear, the connection has been lost. We don't know how or where. But if we can get Mr. Cronkite back, we'll do so. Summing up, a man has been arrested. He's identified as a 22-year-old from Evergreen, Colorado, whose name is listed as John W. Hinckley. He's a sandy-haired, blond young man, 22 years of age, who the Secret Service alleges was wielding a .38 caliber pistol from which he fired from 4 to 6 shots. 4 of them took effect. 3 of them knocked down James Brady, the presidential press secretary, a District of Columbia policeman, and a Secret Service agent who lay on the sidewalk. The 4th bullet, unknown, perhaps even to the president himself, had lodged in Ronald Reagan's left chest. He was rushed on into his limousine, into the protection of the device, which was just there at the curb, from which he was taken immediately to the hospital, which is several blocks from the scene of the hotel where he had given a speech this afternoon. He has undergone surgery for removal of the bullet and repair of the track damage that it made. We are informed reliably that, as is probably customary in the case, he was given a transfusion. He was described as conscious when he entered the hospital. He was described also as having walked in ambulatory under his own power. And now, of course, is under anesthesia. And his wife, Nancy Reagan, has been in the hospital now the better part of a couple of hours. She having rushed over from the White House, she didn't go down to the hotel with him where he made the address. That is the situation as best we know it. Concern was voiced for the condition of James Brady from the outset. He's 40. He was felled, obviously, by a bullet in the head, and he was in a scanning device, a CAT scanner, one of those modern technological miracles that hospitals, well-equipped ones, have. He did not appear to be moving as people saw him wheeled into that scanning device to find out the exact condition of the head wound and where the bullet may lie. Mr. Reagan has been under surgery, we would gather now, for some time. That's an open-ended situation. Probably you don't know what you find until you get in. And the .38 caliber bullet is said to be somewhere in the thoracic area. It struck nothing critical, but it did apparently nick the left lung and may well have collapsed that, which is, again, not an unusual occurrence. George Bush, the vice president, was in Texas. He was making a series of speeches. He was informed he is now en route aboard an Air Force plane to Andrews Air Force Base, where he'll take up station near or in the White House. The cabinet members and other people who make decisions as to how to, in the interregnum, carry on the business of government has gathered. Secretary of State Haig takes a more commanding position. In the absence of George Bush, it next would fall to him, should the president be declared or declare himself to be incapacitated. Mr. Reagan, as we say, is in the hospital now, George Washington University Hospital, several blocks from the White House. His wife is with him. He has undergone surgery, or still perhaps maybe undergoing it. There's a recovery room process, of course, after this, which takes some considerable amount of time. We've received no late bulletins, no keeping up with it from the hospital itself. The White House staff has had a difficult time. It was the author of the first information, which was so heartening, that Mr. Reagan had been missed and wasn't hit or hurt. And they went with that for some time, until Lynn Nofsinger, another aide, an old-time press aide of the president's, came out of the hospital to inform everybody, yes, Mr. Reagan was hit. He had a bullet in his chest. He walked in. He's in stable condition, and we don't know what's going to happen next. What happened next was, as one might guess, was surgery to remove the bullet and repair the damage. The progress of that, the prognosis of this entire afternoon of surprise and horror, isn't known because perhaps no one yet knows it. At least nobody has said. Man's in custody. His background we don't know, except that he is from Colorado, the town of Evergreen, Colorado, and his name is said to be Hinckley. He's young, 22, sandy-haired man of nondescript or at least unknown background. He's in custody. There is no evidence that anybody else was involved in this. And a few moments ago, we heard an audibly shaken Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, I think, explaining the situation as best he understood it from the White House press room.
We have informed our friends abroad of the situation, the president's condition as we know it, stable, now undergoing surgery, and there are absolutely no alert measures that are necessary at this time or contemplated.
That was Alexander Haig, the Secretary of State, who came in to say what the own White House presidential deputies could not say. He, in fact, said just without any advertence that Mr. Reagan was undergoing surgery. He told people that, and this was really not quite confirmed by the White House, although the White House press corps already knew it. So you have the lag time, people trying to find out exactly what's going on from a hospital several blocks away, transmitting it on to the core of the White House staff and the press people who have gathered there. We have now been able to reestablish communication with correspondent Walter Cronkite in Moscow, and Walter was able to file for us this report on its reaction.
It's an eerie feeling, a little like being in another world, perhaps on another planet, sitting here this night looking out a window on the lights of Moscow as the news comes blaring out of the radio and rattling across the teleprinters. There's no way to know what the reaction or feelings of the Soviet leaders may be at this hour of the night. It was just a few hours ago, as a brilliant sunset lit the Kremlin walls, that I saw Soviet Premier Brezhnev's limousine come spurting out of the Spassky Gate, and with its trailing escort car, its blue lights flashing, go roaring toward the Brezhnev home. At that hour, his thoughts undoubtedly were occupied with the reports he must have just received from Warsaw on the government's compromise settlement offer to the labor movement. It was 3 hours later that presumably his phone rang with the report from Washington. That was 10:30 Moscow time. Was Brezhnev already abed? If so, was he awakened with the news? Those are really the trivia questions, I guess. The more serious questions must await further reports on Mr. Reagan's condition. But this correspondent can say that if there's anything more despairing than watching and listening to the horrible news on television and radio at home tonight, it's sitting in a foreign capital, and particularly one where the rivalry with everything American is particularly acute, and knowing that a few hours from now, on the morrow, one's going to have to face a lot of Russians who are going to ask with their eyes, if not their voices, what sort of society is it that our democracy has built in the West? As one whose repertorial career is now included an unsuccessful attack on President Truman and the assassination of President Kennedy, it's a difficult question to answer. This is Walter Cronkite reporting for CBS Radio from Moscow.
And that was Walter's report as he issued it to us just a moment ago. I believe we've now established live contact. And Walter, as you mentioned a moment ago, you've seen it come, you've seen it go, you've seen it fail, and you saw in 1963 the horror of its success. This situation which will make it difficult on the streets of Moscow tomorrow to describe how America works. Has there been any late development there? Is there any indication that anybody really knows what's happened in America? I don't really believe that we have contact with Moscow. I believe that the line is not working as we were told it was. If we get Walter back, we'll attempt to do so. We do have, though, from Andrews Air Force Base, I believe, a situationer which will indicate a little bit more about the imminent arrival of George Bush. This day caught him in Texas. He's flying back. Let's go now to my colleague, John Ferrugia at Andrews.
Reed, the Vice President left Austin, Texas Airport, the municipal airport in Austin, Texas, at approximately 4:11 this afternoon. He should be arriving at Andrews sometime around 7 o'clock tonight. It's approximately 2 hours and 50 minutes from there to here at Andrews. But, of course, they'll be pushing that aircraft probably a little faster than usual. The Vice President spoke in Fort Worth earlier today. He was going down to Austin, Texas to speak to the state legislature and to hold a news conference later this afternoon. He did neither. So once again, he left the airport at 4:11. That's Eastern Standard Time. And he should be arriving here at Andrews Air Force Base at approximately 7 o'clock tonight, at which time we'll have a report for you. This is John Ferrugia reporting from Andrews Air Force Base.
Well, statements, of course, are being issued around the world. In case you're joining us, we should say that President Reagan was wounded in an assassination attempt this afternoon. He was not fatally wounded. He's undergoing surgery. His condition post-surgery is not yet known to us. He was, however, in stable condition when he went to the hospital. As we began, several statements have been issued. The West German Chancellor Schmidt has sent a cable to the president. In fact, those two men talked by telephone only early this morning, deciding what they would do in the event of some intervention internally or externally in Poland. And he said, in part, "Dear President, with deepest disgust, I've just heard about your assassination attempt. I sincerely hope that the news is correct. You are not seriously injured. With my deepest, most sincere wishes for earliest recovery and your personal well-being, I combine my good wishes for your colleagues who also have been injured in this attack." And that is the cable that has been sent by the Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt, who only hours before had a 15-minute telephone conversation with President Reagan, Schmidt in Bonn, the President in the White House, as they coordinated the Western reaction in the event of some untoward incident in Poland. Mr. Carter, the former president, has issued a statement saying he is anxiously awaiting further word of President Reagan's condition and that of the others wounded, and he and Mrs. Carter join the entire nation in prayers for the well-being of all those wounded and for their families. But what about the suspect? What about the man who is not hospitalized, but the man who is now incarcerated or at least in custody? My colleague Ike Pappas has been trying to get some details out of the Washington District Police, and he is now at their headquarters. Ike?
Reed, the suspect has not been identified officially, at least, by the police department as yet. They have only moments ago identified, however, the police officer who was shot and is in serious condition at the Washington Hospital Center. His name is Thomas K. Delahanty of Washington's 3rd District. He is 45 years old. Delahanty is described as a canine officer, one of those police officers who works with dogs. You see them so frequently at public events, the dogs sniffing for bombs and at airports for narcotics and so forth. However, today he was detailed on a special detail at presidential security duty outside of the Hilton Hotel, and was indeed there when the president was shot and the others. And anyway, he is now in serious condition, and the statement that is put out by the police department is that the exact extent of his injuries are not known. I suppose that's because he has not completed the physical examination, whatever, at Washington Hospital Center. He has been with the department, according to the police department, for 17 years. Now, the suspect is still on the 3rd floor of the police headquarters here off of 6th Street in the district. It is just a few blocks from the nation's capital, from Capitol Hill. He is being questioned. We understand from police sources here that the questioning will go on for some hours, that he is being talked to by the Secret Service and also by detectives from the city police force. There is a possibility, according to these sources, that the suspect will be moved this evening from this location to the D.C. City Jail, some blocks away from here. However, that has not been confirmed. There is also the possibility that an arraignment will take place tomorrow morning. The normal hours for arraigning suspects in the city are from 9 a.m. until 12, and they felt that that might be the normal procedure, but they did not preclude the possibility that there would be a special arraignment of this suspect this evening. That is the situation at the moment from the D.C. police headquarters, which, as you can imagine, is a very busy place at this moment. There are just literally dozens of reporters and cameras, police officials, etc., attempting to sort out the various details. And I must say that the details are slow in coming because they want to be absolutely sure of every fact. And also, there's a great concern here. You could feel it underneath the official poise that these police officers show. There is the concern that they don't want to have another situation such as we saw in Dallas with Ruby and Oswald, in which Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald as he was leaving the police headquarters in Dallas. And we all know the consequences of that. So there is concern here, again, for the safety of the suspect, and whether we will know whether he is moved is still doubtful. That's the current situation, Reed, at D.C. Police Headquarters.
And other authorities, including the Secret Service, have been quoted as identifying that suspect as John W. Hinckley, Jr. of Evergreen, Colorado. No more information really is known about him, except he is the man being held as the alleged assailant, a man who, with a .38 caliber revolver, fired from 4 to 6 bullets, 4 of them taking effect, one of them striking the press secretary, James Brady, in the head, another one hitting a Secret Service agent, another one hitting a District of Columbia policeman, and the 4th bullet lodging, as we learned to our shock later, in the left chest of the President of the United States, who is undergoing or has just undergone surgery for removal of the bullet and for repair of the damage the bullet made in its entry. So we don't really know too much about him, this man from Colorado, and perhaps my colleague Morton Dean knows more. Morton, what have you been able to find out?
We don't know much more, Reed. I was just talking with a resident who is a personal friend of one of our CBS colleagues, a resident of Evergreen, has a business office there, Evergreen, Colorado, where the suspect's family lives, and he said that a squad of about 6 Secret Service agents had just come into his office looking for the family's home, so apparently they are on the way to learn more about the young man themselves. We are told that to the best of the information of these local people there, Hinckley is 23 years old. They believe he did attend the local high school, Evergreen High School, and that his family lives in what was described to me as the wealthiest part of this very wealthy Denver suburb. I know no more than that.
So the information has a habit of flowing in bits and pieces, and sometimes it backs up and goes the other direction for a few moments. Did it appear to you, Mort, that it was strange that the White House first put out the word, the president's okay, he's not hit, he's not hurt? I wonder if it's possible that perhaps that was an intended bit of misinformation for the moment.
Well, possibly. I remember my initial reaction upon seeing the tape and hearing that was, do you want to bet? I thought at the time that it was uncertain, but I think that information was based on some eyewitness reports that a president seemed to have been thrust into the car and did not appear to have been hit. And then later we heard a report that the president himself did not know that he had been wounded until he arrived at the hospital, which is hard to believe, but adrenaline, when it's flowing, does some rather strange things.
So we'll wait until, first of all, we receive the post-operative report from George Washington University Hospital on the progress of the operation for the bullet removal and the prognosis for recovery of the president. One of those days that caught the world watching Poland when suddenly it was polarized in Washington, D.C., this nation's own capital. Secretary of State Haig is in the White House, and he will, I presume, remain there until the situation becomes more clear. They're awaiting the arrival from Texas of Vice President George Bush, who, of course, would assume command in the event of the incapacity of Mr. Reagan to continue it. But for now, nothing has been determined legally or constitutionally to the effect that Mr. Reagan is not able to lead the country. And we're going to find out more about that, not from constitutionalists probably, but from doctors, once this thing settles down. We do have reaction coming in from all over the place. We've heard from Margaret Thatcher early on, a confidant and good friend, and a political ally of Mr. Reagan's from London. We have had some comment from Helmut Schmidt of West Germany, who, as we mentioned, spoke only today with the president by telephone. They talked mainly about Poland, and on the passing, by the way, of Mr. Schmidt's father, the president having relayed his condolences to him at first about that. We do have some more reaction coming in from Plains, Georgia, where the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter's, had something to say. My colleague John Shane's down there.
Former President Jimmy Carter was at his home here in Plains when he heard the news of the shooting. His office has put out a brief statement saying, quote, President Carter is anxiously awaiting further word on President Reagan's condition and that of the others wounded. He and Mrs. Carter join the entire nation in prayer for the well-being of all those wounded and for their families, end of quote. John Shane at Plains, Georgia.
And so it continues. Well wishes and confusion, expressions of shock from foreign nations who don't understand, as we don't also sometimes, the machinations of America's society. The president, as we have said, in case you possibly could not have heard, was emerging from a Washington hotel, the Hilton, when he was hit by a bullet. He just delivered a speech, which was a pitch for his economic program to a trades affiliate of the AFL-CIO. And that was the scene. He was wounded slightly. We hope it was slightly. He had a bullet in the chest. James Brady, his press secretary, more seriously wounded with a bullet in the head. And the two officers of the law, Delahanty of the Metropolitan Police, was wounded. He's said to be in bad shape. Critical condition, we're told. And the Secret Service agent McCarthy also was wounded. An assailant's in custody. George Herman, my colleague George, is now in Washington. George, can you add to this?
Well, Reed, one further note. Our local station here, WDVM, which has friends inside the hospital, has reported that in the process of exploratory surgery, they have found some minor bleeding in the president's chest and lung. They found no blood or reason to expect any blood in his abdomen, that the exploratory surgery was proceeding and that all was going well as far as the surgical process was concerned. George Washington University Hospital is a teaching hospital. It is one of the best hospitals in Washington. Presidents, of course, are traditionally taken to Walter Reed, but that's largely because of the security of a military hospital like Walter Reed or Bethesda Naval Hospital. But George Washington University is a fine first-class hospital in the downtown Washington, only blocks from the White House. and was the quickest and, I suppose, in any sense at all, the wisest place to take the president. If he should have a long convalescence in hospital, it's possible that they might want to take him to Walter Reed, once again, simply for security reasons. There is no sort of VIP suite in George Washington University Hospital as there is at Walter Reed. Still no word at all, as many Washington and other reporters around the country will be wondering, no word at all about James Brady, the press secretary. The CBS News television tapes of Mr. Brady when he was shot show him lying on the sidewalk, apparently conscious, his feet moving, but unpleasantly large puddle of blood by his head where he was shot. So still no word. We do know that he is also undergoing surgery at the moment after a CAT scan. It's a kind of a complicated computer-assisted X-ray of the head to show exactly where the bullet was and what its path had taken and what remedy was advisable under the circumstances. So actually no word on him. And the other two, I think you've already reported on, Mr. Delahanty and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy, who was shot in the chest. We only know that his condition is still considered to be critical, whereas Mr. Delahanty, the police agent of 12 years' experience on the force here in Washington, has a bullet in the neck, and he is not any longer on the critical list. He's now considered on the serious list, which is, I'm sure his family would agree, somewhat of an improvement, although not an awful lot. So that is about the situation at the moment with the reports coming in, and I think the rest of it you have covered fairly well, and I would simply be repeating what you have said.
Thank you, George Herman in Washington, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from Mr. Herman through the night. George, if I may, I think it might be well to understand why we're not being given a great deal of information from the hospital about the president's condition. I suppose even in a post-operative fashion, you have a recovery process, and it may take people just a matter of time to work it up, as it were.
Well, as a matter of fact, I've had some experience with the thoracic department of George Washington University Hospital, fine surgeons who operated on one of my children there, and they like to do their work, like any surgeons, in thorough, concentrated fashion, thinking only of the work they are doing. And anybody who's ever had a relative in a hospital knows that you really have to wait until the surgery is over, and there's been a brief period of observing the signs, the vital signs of the patient after the surgery, before a surgeon is likely to come out and talk to you. And especially in this case, where, of course, the doctors, as well as the White House people who are gathered at the hospital, quite a large contingent of White House staff gathered at the hospital, are extremely anxious that there should be no false excitement, no unnecessary panic, so to speak, and they are very anxious to get a definitive, clear, cool assessment of exactly what the situation is. I've been through this process now, Reed, with, I guess, three presidents previously, of three presidents perhaps, including this, with President Eisenhower's heart attack, through President Kennedy's assassination, and now this attempt, of course, George Wallace being shot just outside Washington in a shopping center right near here, and now President Reagan. And the anxiety of the press is understandable to get news because the American people want to know where their leaders are and what their conditions are, but the interests and anxieties of the doctors and of the White House staff, and of course the candidate staff in the case of George Wallace, run in a different direction, and that is to assess fully and in every detail so that when they do give a report, it's not some fragmented, nonsensical thing, as happened in the early days of President Eisenhower's illness. At one point, one of President Eisenhower's, when he had a slight stroke while he was in the White House after his heart attack, one of President Eisenhower's aides came rushing out into the press room in response to queries from the press and said he's had a cerebral infarct, which, as I understand it, is some kind of a heart attack. Well, of course, it wasn't. It was a stroke, an injury to the brain. So the anxiety after all this experience on the part of White House staff people who have studied the history of these things is to make sure not that you get it out quickly, but that you get it out correctly, because it is extremely important.
Thank you, George. To tell you what we do know, Mr. Reagan was wounded by one of several bullets that were fired at him and his party as he left a Washington hotel where he had given a speech this afternoon. He was wounded in the left chest. He has undergone surgery for removal of the bullet. He walked into the hospital, we are told, was conscious at the time, and there he has undergone surgery, his condition described last as stable. His press secretary, James Brady, was apparently more severely wounded with a bullet in the head. His condition has not been released, but he has now undergone a scan to determine the extent of damage there. 2 others also were hit, a Metropolitan Policeman, Delahanty, a Secret Service agent named McCarthy, and McCarthy is believed to be badly hurt. The president is alive. He is in surgery. The vice president is flying back from Texas to Washington. Secretary of State Haig is coordinating things from the White House, and that is what we know. Reed Collins, CBS News, New York.
This is Cannon on CCO Radio. We're going to get CBS News, and I might mention that because of the shooting of the president, here at CCO we will not be running our regular commercial programs. We'll keep you apprised with our reports from CBS and also from our local WCCO News Bureau. And we will stay with this coverage until we're certain the president is safe and give you all the details. Over WCCO, Minneapolis, St. Paul, where it's 49 degrees, and it's now 4 o'clock.
CBS News, Douglas Edwards reporting. President Reagan was shot in the left chest in an assassination attempt shortly before 3 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon as he left the Washington Hilton Hotel after addressing the AFL-CIO. The bullet pierced the president's left lung, and he has been in surgery for some time now. George Herman has reported that the president is undergoing exploratory surgery, that there was some bleeding in the lung area, but none in the abdominal region. We also have been told the president was given a blood transfusion. His condition is reported as stable. Mrs. Reagan is at his side. She rushed there from the White House when she got word of the assassination attempt. White House officials said Mr. Reagan walked into the hospital and was chatting with his aides as he did so. The Secret Service has identified President Reagan's assailant as John Warnock Hinckley, 22 years of age, of Evergreen, Colorado. He was immediately tackled and pinned to the pavement by police officers and the Secret Service. And then he was whisked away by a squad car to a nearby precinct. He reportedly was not injured in the incident. The Secret Service spokesman said Hinckley had fired a .38 caliber revolver. Former President Jimmy Carter has issued a statement saying he is anxiously awaiting further word of President Reagan's condition and that of the others who were wounded. He said he and Mrs. Carter join the entire nation in prayers for the well-being of all those wounded and their families. A word from Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, who lost 2 of his brothers by assassination. Senator Kennedy said, "With our prayers for those who have been wounded, I think we must go our resolution to rid our society of hatred. Violence and hatred are alien to everything this country is about." All trading on the nation's stock exchanges was halted moments after the shooting of the president. All of the markets indicated they would not resume trading today. The spokesman for the New York Stock Exchange said the last time trading was halted because of a news event was on January 25th, 1973, for the funeral of President Lyndon Johnson. Commandos, in other news, stormed the hijacked Indonesian airliner at Bangkok Airport today, rescuing all but one of the hostages and killing 3 hijackers and arresting 2 others.
Well, why don't we go to CBS in Washington now? You're on CCO Radio. It's 5:18. It's 49 degrees, Twin Cities.
This is Reed Collins, CBS News, New York, where we are continuing our coverage of the attempt on the life of President Ronald Reagan that happened a few hours ago in Washington, D.C., where the president had just completed a speech to the AFL-CIO Building Trades Council seeking labor support for his tax cut and austerity program that he's trying to push on Capitol Hill. Mr. Reagan had just exited the hotel where the speech had been delivered when a fusillade of shots rang out, 4, perhaps 6 of them. 3 men went down immediately on the sidewalk. The presidential press secretary, James Brady, a Secret Service man, Tim McCarthy, a District of Columbia policeman, Thomas Delahanty. They didn't move very much. The president was whisked into his limousine. He looked shocked. He had his arm up in the air. It came back down. He looked surprised, but he didn't look injured. And in fact, the White House made the announcement very quickly that Mr. Reagan had not been hurt by any of the bullets fired in his direction. As attention was focused on the other men being attended to on the sidewalk, It became clear later that Mr. Reagan was not returning to the White House, that the limousine was going to George Washington University Hospital, where indeed it did. He got out of the limousine, we're told, walked into the hospital holding his hand over his left chest. He had, in fact, been wounded by one of those bullets, a .22 caliber round from a pistol, one of several fired from a young suspect who now is in police custody. Since that time, Mr. Reagan's undergone surgery of some extent. It's believed the bullet may still be lodged inside a lung. He received a precautionary and routine blood transfusion. His wife, Mrs. Reagan, was at the scene, hurrying to the hospital from the White House a few blocks away. At the hospital now, to give us the latest as we can glean it from there, my colleague, CBS News correspondent Nelson Benton. Nelson, what's happening?
As of about 12 minutes ago, President Reagan was still in surgery for that wound in the left chest. However, White House press aide Len Nofziger said that the president will be out of surgery shortly. Nofziger came in to talk to reporters in a press room that has been set up at George Washington Hospital, he said, to dispel some rumors. One of those rumors he wanted to dispel. He said the president had not undergone open surgery. Nofziger said that doctors had come out and talked to White House people, telling them that the president is in good condition. Another rumor that Nofziger said he wanted to dispel was the report that Press Secretary James Brady, who was shot in the same incident, had died. He said that James Brady is in serious condition, is still in surgery. Nofziger was asked, what is James Brady's condition? He did not answer that question. But repeating, the White House press office says that President Reagan is in good condition and will be coming out of surgery shortly. Before he went in, Nofziger said, he was conscious, spoke to White House aides, spoke to Mrs. Reagan saying, quote, honey, I forgot to duck, unquote. Reed?
Nelson, is there an indication that when he does come out and goes into the recovery room that there'll be additional word? Do you expect that?
We have been told that when President Reagan comes out of surgery, we will be told. We're also told that a doctor who is familiar with the wound and the kind of treatment that is needed for it will talk to reporters later in the evening.
And this will probably come first from the hospital before it does from the White House. Is that your understanding?
That's anybody's guess, Reed.
Well, Nelson and everybody else, we have been somewhat at the mercy of guesswork all afternoon. At first it was reported, as we've said, that the president was not hit. That was wrong. It turned out that he was. There was the erroneous sequence of announcements that Mr. Brady had been mortally wounded. And we had first the information that the bullets used in the revolver in the case was a .38 caliber pistol, which would make a world of difference to a man being shot in the chest. Now it turns out much later the Secret Service has determined that the suspect used a .22 caliber pistol, which probably accounts for the survivability and the ambulatoriness of the president himself. The other men wounded, Secret Service Agent McCarthy and the policeman Delahanty, are said to be now in improving condition. One has a bullet wound in the upper thorax. The other man has a wound in the neck. The suspect in question is identified as a young man, probably 25 years of age, from Evergreen, Colorado. That's a rather well-to-do suburb up in the hills from Denver, Colorado. His name has been listed by the Secret Service as John Hinckley. He's described as the scion of an oil exploration chief executive who at one time went to Yale, described by his neighbors as a Yale dropout. Beyond that, no one exactly knows because he's been sequestered in the District of Columbia jail and moved to an undisclosed location under very careful security. CBS News correspondent Jim McManus was talking to the man who first made it known that the president had in fact been wounded, the White House aide Lynn Nofziger. He spoke with him just outside George Washington Hospital.
The president's condition is good. It is stable. He should be out of surgery shortly. He may be since I left. The thing I wish to repeat is there have been a lot of bad rumors going around. He has not had open heart surgery. He is in good shape. And we will have a briefing by a medical doctor probably within the hour, and they can go into all the details of it.
We had heard that the president was conscious going into the operating room and that he was, in fact, joking. Are those rumors correct?
That is absolutely right. He was conscious, and he said to the doctors in the operating room, "I hope you're all Republicans."
What about Mrs. Reagan? How is she holding up?
Mrs. Reagan is fine. She's calm. She's concerned about her husband. She's concerned about Jim Brady. She's concerned, of course, about the other 2 wounded men, but she is fine.
Now, Lynn, there are rumors going around about the condition of Jim Brady, that he is in very serious condition. Can you tell us anything about Jim Brady?
I cannot comment on that. He is in surgery, and that is all I can tell you.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn.
James Brady was 40 years old. He's been with the president now during the presidency. He started out with the Connally campaign and then was moved over to the Reagan campaign when Governor Connally foundered in South Carolina during the primary season. And he's been the man, a portly gentleman who follows the president around. It's not surprising to most that he was in the line of fire, because it's been Mr. Brady's job to keep the president moving, Mr. Reagan having had the habit of responding repeatedly to questions from reporters and correspondents as he made his way along the sidewalk. Somebody today, in fact, had shouted out the name Mr. Reagan as if to ask a question, and this had him turn. This may have been good, it may have been bad, who knows, but at any rate, he took the bullet apparently in the front of his left chest, having turned, apparently, to respond to the calling of his name when the bullets were fired from that small pistol. That's the situation as we know it now. There has been long surgery, longer than medical experts had anticipated would be required for a bullet wound as described to us by the hospital and by the White House aides. But we don't have any reason to speculate on the length of that, except for the fact that we expect to hear more about it soon. Well, the entire world is going to pause until the prognosis of today's litany of lugubrious events has been fully unraveled. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has postponed tonight's Oscar presentations because of the shooting. Mr. Reagan had been scheduled, for example, to open the ceremony tonight with a speech he'd already videotaped, and this, of course, would have been unseemly, so the ceremony has been put off 24 hours until tomorrow night. The third time something like this has been postponed. In 1938, there was some bad flooding, and then in 1968, the assassination of the civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., also forced postponement of the Oscar award ceremony. Talking to CBS correspondent Jed Duval in the studios in Washington is Dr. Barry Levine. He's associated with George Washington Hospital. He's a specialist in thoracic surgery, and he discussed the possible consequences of the kind of thing sustained today by President Reagan.
What have you learned?
Well, basically, the last time I spoke to anyone, President Reagan was still in the operating room. Apparently, when he came into the emergency room with a gunshot wound to the left chest, initially, as usually in cases like this, apparently the chest x-ray showed a collapsed lung, and a chest tube was placed in the emergency room to re-expand the lung and also drain any blood which was in the left chest, and apparently a fairly significant volume of blood came out of the chest tube. I think one of the concerns was the fact that the bullet was lodged somewhere close to the heart, and the physicians who were taking care of him were concerned about the proximity of the bullet to the heart and some of the major blood vessels in the chest.
Have you worked on cases like this before? Similar gunshot wounds, yes. Individuals in the same hospital?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Is it a fairly, I don't want to say routine, but is it a surgery that can be accomplished without too much danger?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, in most patients who do have gunshot wounds to the chest, they do not require going to the operating room. In most cases, you can just simply insert a tube into the chest to re-expand the lung and drain any blood in the chest. And probably, I think most large studies have shown only something like 10 to 20% of patients with gunshot wounds to the chest even require surgery. Major surgery.
Have your associates over at the hospital told you where the bullet is in the president's chest? Is it in the lung or near the lung?
Well, apparently the bullet, from what I understand, the bullet went through the lower lobe of the left lung, and of course, that's where the bleeding appeared to have come from. Apparently the bullet has not injured the heart, And in most cases, unless the bullet is lodged within a major blood vessel or a chamber of the heart, in most places a bullet does not have to be removed.
Is it common that a patient can be hit with a bullet the way the president apparently was and can get into a car and ride to the hospital and then get out of the car and walk into the hospital conscious and alert?
That's not uncommon at all, unless, of course, the patient has a major vascular injury or cardiac injury where he's lost a tremendous volume of blood in a relatively short period of time and is in shock. But it's certainly consistent with some minor injury and fairly minor bleeding that on a short trip, like I'm sure it was for him to get to the hotel, from the hotel to the hospital, that he could have walked into the hospital.
Now, this surgery has apparently been going on, I think, for a little more than 2 hours.
I'm not exactly sure when it started or if it's still going on.
Well, we just heard Knopfsinger, the president's aide, say he should be out shortly. Right. So 2 or 2.5 hours, does that sound like the generally within the time period that an operation like this would take?
Yeah, it could take varying amounts of time depending on exactly what is found at the time of surgery and what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if there are major injuries, they take longer periods of time to repair than some minor injuries.
Thank you, Doctor.
And that's Dr. Barry Levine, who's associated with George Washington University Hospital. He's a specialist in chest surgery of this sort and gives us some sort of insight. Says, yes, it is possible that a man can be shot and not even know it and can walk and talk and even, as President Reagan did, joke with the team of surgeons, hoping they're all Republicans. Probably they are. And with his wife, Nancy Reagan, to whom he said, honey, I forgot to duck. This is the longest hour, I suppose, that anybody in the White House staff has had to endure trying to determine how the information should be threaded through the White House or whether it should come directly from the hospital. And this has given rise to several reports, some of them rather unfortunate. It was officially never announced, but it was announced through congressional aides and a senatorial office that Presidential Press Secretary Brady had succumbed. This Lynn Knopfsinger denies, and the hospital has made no announcement to that effect at all. It was also said at first the president wasn't hit by any of the bullets, and this, of course, was retracted when it became apparent that he was walking into the hospital holding his chest. It was reported from the Secret Service that the gun used was a .38 caliber pistol, which would have done much more damage, obviously, than the small .22 caliber pistol, which in fact it was. The Secret Service claims that it got the idea of the caliber of the gun because the man in question, the suspect, had a receipt for the purchase of a .38 caliber pistol in his pocket. And so it goes. Even the powers of observation of trained observers at the scene failed to detect the fact that the president had, in fact, been shot. It's been going that way all day. We've had various reports of this and that have come and gone. The essentials of it, however, have boiled down to the fact that Mr. Reagan was wounded in the chest, apparently missing all vital organs, nipping the lower lobe of the left lung, however, and perhaps lodging inside there. We've had the world's reaction. We've had a lot of reaction from world capitals and world leaders. But the man in the street, Rob Armstrong, you've been out among just folks, at least here in New York City. What are people thinking? What are they saying?
Reed, well, by the height of the evening rush hour, most people said they had heard the news. Most people were aware that the president had been shot. Many asked me what I knew about his condition, how he was doing, how the others were doing. The general reaction was, as you would expect, shock, outrage. At Pennsylvania Station, where a lot of commuters were headed home, they said that they intended to spend the evening watching television and listening to the radio to find out how things are going. One man offered his best to the families and said that he felt very badly for them, that the attention was being focused on the president, but that 3 others had been shot and they should not be forgotten. One other woman said that she believes this is indicative of a society-wide problem, that we are violent, we Americans. New York Mayor Ed Koch said that he was stunned, and he said this strengthens the case for those who support a national gun control law. I guess One young man who identified himself as a Russian immigrant perhaps put it best. He said he is not surprised. He said this is a violent country.
And while we were speaking, we discovered that Vice President Bush has arrived. His plane is at Andrews Air Force Base. He got there a couple of minutes ago, made no statement that we're aware of, and left immediately by helicopter for downtown Washington, just a flutter away. So he should be on station soon, and he'll probably confer with Secretary of State Haig, the Attorney General, and the others, and no doubt go to the hospital when that's possible. George Bush was way off home in Texas today making a speech when he got the word. President Reagan's son was going to perform this evening with the Joffrey Ballet in Lincoln, Nebraska. He chartered a jet, and he and his new bride are airborne. They, too, are speeding eastward to be with his father and her father-in-law. Mrs. Reagan has been at the hospital since the word reached the White House that her husband had been wounded. And that is the situation and the circumstance as we know it. In terms of comment, we've heard those from the people out in the street. There's other comment, those with special interest in this. I think one of them is Benjamin Hooks. He's now executive director of the NAACP, who expresses his concern and his dismay over the shooting of President Reagan.
And we've sent a telegram to the White House expressing our dismay, our shock, and certainly we are praying for the speedy recovery of President Reagan and the others who were wounded along with him. And I've been in touch with some of our major branches, some of our board of directors, and all of us are praying not only for recovery for President Reagan, but others. I really am not quite composed. It's a heart sickening, very emotional time for us here at the NAACP, and we are truly concerned about it, and we hope that justice can be done and that we can create a climate where this kind of thing will not occur in this nation.
The sentiments of Benjamin Hooks, the executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This has been indicative, I think, of the drawing together of people in the horror of the scene, in which political differences and other differences certainly do submerge and disappear. And the words of Walter Cronkite, who spoke to us earlier in the day from Moscow, were a little prophetic. He felt isolated. He felt terribly concerned for something that had repeated itself in the history of his long career at CBS. He covered an attempted assassination of President Truman and the assassination of President Kennedy, various other attempts, as we know. President Ford had a shot taken at him. And he felt embarrassment also for the fact that when dawn breaks over Moscow, he'll have to go out in those streets and speak to people in that very tightly controlled society, and they will ask him, as he said, either with their mouths or certainly with their eyes, what's going on out there in the West, your country. People in London have had the same effect. They have deluged the U.S. Embassy there with requests for information and have come in to sign the book and to say, yes, we're Americans, and we feel for this situation. A sense of embarrassment also to the world traveler at a time like this. So we're still waiting word from the hospital on the post-operative condition, the prognosis, if you will, of Mr. Reagan, who has undergone surgery for repair of a bullet wound in the left chest, a .22 caliber bullet which nicked, we're told, the lower lobe of a lung. He got a blood transfusion, which is not unusual. It's a precaution which is normally taken. He was able to walk into the hospital from his limousine. He joked with his wife, Nancy, said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." That is an alleged direct quote. And he discussed with the surgeons their politics before they put him under the anesthetic, and he began the operation. The Vice President, George Bush, has arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. He's helicopter-bound now for the Capitol itself, which is some 12 miles away, and should be there momentarily. Secretary of State Alexander Haig is coordinating all the efforts inside the White House. He said himself that there's been no need, except for the State Department, to send the usual notification messages to the other world capitals that the president has been shot, not seriously wounded, and that the Vice President, Mr. Bush, is on his way back to the Capitol. This is courtesy, and it's diplomacy, and it has been done. There's been no big alert. There's been nothing really going on in terms of military preparedness or awareness that is not normal. So we're still waiting to find out how long it will be that the president will be laid up. He has just celebrated his 70th birthday, February the 6th. As we know, he keeps himself in good shape, gets rest, chops wood, rides horses, and is described by all who know him, including his doctors, as a robust man. Getting back to the event of the day, among those several people out on that busy Washington street outside the hotel, right in sight of the shooting, was a man who became an eyewitness named Willis King. And he spoke with our correspondent, Robert Shackney.
They brought the press secretary in first. They rolled him back. And the president walked in holding his... One guy was holding him on the side, and he was holding his...
and what did you see? I mean, was he bleeding badly?
Well, I couldn't see that much blood because he still had on his jacket, and you could see a little spot of blood up on this.
But he was walking?
Yeah, he was walking.
And that's the scene as described by one man who happened by. Well, news of this attack on Mr. Reagan was carried around the world in moments' time, given the modern technology of transmissions. Newspapers in London are blaring the news in their own fashion, as our correspondent Martha Teichner reports.
The first of the morning papers are on the streets in London now with front-page stories about the Reagan assassination attempt, even though the shooting occurred as the papers normally go to press. In the Daily Express, the story covered the entire front page, inch-and-a-half headlines. Reagan is shot down by gunmen. True to its tabloid format, the Express describes Nancy Reagan as ashen-faced as she was driven to the hospital. It says the would-be assassin was hauled away. More subdued coverage in the Daily Telegraph, but still it took up half the front page. The headline, "Bullet an inch from heart," with a picture of President Reagan, his face contorted with pain, and another of Press Secretary James Brady lying on the ground. Evening television newscasts are on in London late enough so that British audiences and Americans in London could see much the same early coverage that was seen in the United States after the shooting. The American Embassy reports hundreds of phone calls, Americans asking for facts, calling to express their sympathy, not sure where else to call. But so far, there have been no gatherings or vigils of any kind as expressions of concern. Martha Teichner, CBS News, London.
If you count it up, I think you'll find about 7 presidents of this country have been targets in this century of assassination attempts. John F. Kennedy, killed more than 17 years ago in the motorcade in Dallas. President McKinley shot in 1901 in an appearance in Buffalo, New York. Last such incidents before today's, President Ford, the target of 2 attempts to kill him, made separately by 2 women just within weeks of one another. This was in 1975 in California. Gun, of course, is figured not only in the death of presidents. We had Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, the former Congressman Alec Lowenstein, John Lennon, Medgar Evers. That long litany is almost endless. Men who have died by gunfire in public life. Hundreds of other prominent Americans and thousands who were not so prominent. This always brings calls for tighter gun controls. Guns are for sale, some of them at least legally, in 50 states. Some states require permits and some don't. Guns available illegally, though, almost everywhere. Mr. Reagan himself, as you know, has been a strict opponent of gun controls, has said in the past such measures, including registration of firearms, would not really remove guns from the commissions of crime. He even said recently in some places, like Arizona, people felt more secure because they could own and carry a gun. Mr. Reagan's frequently argued, as do many opponents of gun control, that guns don't kill, that people do. Mr. Reagan has supported some additional mandatory prison sentences, though, of something from 5 to 15 years for anyone convicted of using a gun in the commission of a crime. President Ford, reflecting on the 2 attempts on his life, rejected any idea of reducing his public profile. We'll probably hear calls for this in the wake of today's events. Mr. Ford said no president would cower in the face of a limited number of people who want to take the law into their own hands. And those were the words of a man who'd been there, so to speak. Edward Kennedy issued a long statement today, he having perhaps the most personal relationship with this type of terror of all of us. He said he is sure, as all Americans are, that the news of the attack on President Reagan saddens everyone, said he prays for his recovery, and all of us feel a sense of sadness and grief about the wounds inflicted on the White House press secretary, the Secret Service agent, and the police officer. Mr. Kennedy goes on to say his family was touched by violence. Year after year in recent times, we've seen violence in this country. And he recounts, my brother, John Kennedy, my brother, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, George Wallace, Al Lowenstein, Vernon Jordan, and the attacks on President Ford, and now this one on President Reagan. All of us understand, said Senator Kennedy, all of these good individuals had a common purpose, and that was to make this a better country. All of them were committed to the public interest for the people of this nation and to the good of mankind throughout the world. Violence and hatred have no place in our society or in our country. Yet we see it continue in our society and our country. All of us who care about this country and about our fellow citizens, he says, bear an important responsibility in whatever way we possibly can to rid America of the kind of violence and hatred that we have seen today and so often in recent years. Our sympathy and concern, he concludes, go to the President and First Lady and all of those who were shot today and to their families. Talking to reporters out on the West Coast, Mr. Reagan's eldest son, Michael, discussed this afternoon's events and what he knew of his father's condition.
My father has come out of surgery in fine shape. He's in good condition. As my father asked before he went into surgery, and subsequently as we found out it was good Republicans doing the surgery, so he is in good shape, and we plan to just keep in touch the same way all of you are keeping in touch.
Did you believe this when you heard it this morning?
No, not really. I was in a business meeting when it happened, and I've had better days, and I hope to have many better days to come. And it's sad things like this happen, but I'm just hopeful that and happy that my father has come through it. And as I say, that in my house, we are indeed praying for the other people that were wounded.
Mike, have they told you exactly what damage was done by the bullet?
Not really, no. Only that it was, in the left side, and that he is indeed doing well and in good spirits. My dad's been in good spirits for 70 years. I plan for him to be in spirits for another 70 years.
Those are the words of Michael Reagan on the West Coast. As we heard, the other son, the ballet dancer, was found to be in Lincoln, Nebraska when this event overtook him, and he is aboard a chartered plane, a jet plane, flying, having foregone tonight's exercise, and he's on his way back to the Capitol. Should be nearing there very soon. Another interesting bit of information, our station in Dallas, Texas, KRLD, where the suspect, John Hinckley, lived for some time, says a pawn shop there has said that Hinckley was sold a .22 caliber pistol. The information is that the sale was made before last November's election. There is no indication that that was the pistol that was used today, except for the fact that a pawn shop is quoted as having said it sold him one. The Secret Service, which first announced that the caliber of the weapon was .38, got that information later, it says, by looking at a slip of sale for a .38 caliber pistol, which it says it found in Hinckley's pocket. And that was the first of a series of erroneous reports we were given about what actually had happened in Washington today, that everybody had been shot with a much higher caliber gun than .22. But .22 it was, and the slug, we're told, still remains somewhere in the lower left lobe of Mr. Reagan's lung, the doctors having decided not to take it out right away, if it may have fragmented, maybe in pieces, and the lung, as we're told by physicians, has a marvelous recuperative capacity, and lungs heal, whereas arteries and other things might have more difficulty. So the president spoke as he walked in, told people surrounding him, don't worry, told his wife, honey, I forgot to duck, and joked with the hospital staff as they were preparing to give him the anesthetic, wanted to make sure they were all Republicans, and as his son Mike says out on the West Coast, that determination was made that they pretty nearly all were. So, Mr. Reagan, we're still waiting for hospital word, for authoritative word from surgeons who performed the operation, who can tell us who were there, who can tell us the extent of the damage and the prognosis. The vice president is in the Capitol. He'll be aided by the other members of the cabinet in making any decisions which are incumbent upon him now. Secretary Haig said that Mr. Reagan still is the functioning president of the United States, however, except that it's obvious he may need a little additional counseling and advice to perform that office in the near future. So, we've had another one, another attempt which has felled 3 people on a street, has severely wounded the presidential press secretary, who was, as is his duty, in the line of fire, wounded a Secret Service agent, wounded a District of Columbia policeman, and wounded the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan hospitalized tonight. We're awaiting word on the exact prognosis to see how long he may be here and how long his recovery period may be. His wife, Mrs. Reagan's with him. One of his children is flying from the Midwest to be with him. The world has said its prayers are with him, and a shocked and embarrassed nation is thinking of him. And there'll be no Oscar awards tonight. Mr. Reagan had already pre-taped a little introductory item that he was going to be shown on television this evening. Instead, he's in Washington University Hospital, recovering from a bullet wound which was sustained in an attempt on his life. This is Reed Collins, CBS News, New York.
You're in tune with WCCO, Minneapolis, St. Paul, 49 degrees. It's 6 o'clock.
And this is Dan Hertzgaard with WCCO Radio News. Following today's assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan, Minnesota Governor Al Quie responded from western Minnesota, where he had planned to meet tonight with county officials.
Well, it's shocking to hear the news, and one lives in concern that can happen to the chief executive, and you hope that it never will. But it does bring back the memories of other situations like that, 1963, and then again when Wallace, the attempt was made on his life during the campaign. And I imagine that we feel so closely about it because we see that person on television and read about him, and it's so much of a part of our lives, and the president is the leader of our country. But I surely hope and pray that he'll recover well and be able to give the good leadership that he's been giving to this nation.
Currently, the president is listed in good and stable condition. There were 3 others wounded in the incident, including Presidential Press Secretary James Brady, who is said to be in very critical condition at this point, and also wounded were a Secret Service agent and a Washington, D.C. policeman. A 22-year-old Colorado man has been arrested and identified as John Hinckley of Evergreen, Colorado.
It's now 6 minutes past 6 o'clock on CCO. It is 48 degrees. The Twins traded center fielder Ken Landreau to the Los Angeles Dodgers today for infielder Mickey Hatcher and 2 minor league players. Landreau was acquired by the Twins in 1979 in the deal that sent Rod Carew to the California Angels. He hit .305 with 15 home runs his first year with the club, but he slipped to .281 with 7 home runs last season. Hatcher hit .226 in the last part of the 1980 season for the Dodgers. In 1979, he led the Pacific Coast League in hitting with a .371 average. A Twins spokesman says Hatcher, who has been playing third base, will be given a chance to play first base for Minnesota. The Twins also picked up first baseman Kelly Snyder and Matt Reeves, a left-handed pitcher in the trade. Both will be sent to the Twins Toledo Farm Club. The Twins open up the season a week from Thursday at the Met against Oakland, and you'll hear the broadcast here on CCO. Today, in Grapefruit Circuit play, Pittsburgh 9, the Twins 8. The weatherman says this at 7 minutes past 6. Low tonight in the Twin Cities 40. High tomorrow 60 with a 50% chance of rain tomorrow. In Fairmont now, it's 47. Mankato 43. And Bemidji 40. 47 in St. Cloud. Chicago 59 and partly sunny. Partly clear, I should say. In North Dakota, Grand Forks 44. Bismarck 53. Sioux Falls 54. Des Moines 56. The extended forecast for the Twin Cities metropolitan area Thursday through Saturday has partly cloudy skies Thursday with highs in the upper 50s. to lower 60s. Showers Friday, highs around 60. Saturday, partly cloudy and about 55. Normal high and low for the period 48 and 29. So this spring weather will continue with us for the next week or so. On Sunday, March 22nd, at 7:17 a.m., the body of a white female was recovered from Lake Nokomis in Minneapolis. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office is seeking your cooperation in making identification of this individual. The deceased is 5 foot 6 inches in height, weight 130, brown hair tied back in a ponytail, blue eyes, estimated age between 40 to 60 years. She was wearing polyester green slacks, a red and yellow print blouse, an olive drab coat, and white work-type shoes. The only jewelry on the body was a gold wedding-type band and a mother's type ring with 4 stones. Please contact the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office at 347-7125 if you know the identity of this person. It's now 8 minutes past 6 at CCO on the Cannon program. 48 degrees, Twin Cities. President Ronald Reagan is reported to be in good and stable condition at George Washington University Hospital in the nation's capital following an assassination attempt outside the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon. Since the president walked into the hospital, the reports on his condition have all been favorable, both before and during the surgery on the president. In an effort to find out more about the president's wound, WCCO Radio's Rich Holder talked at length with Dr. John Najarian of the University of Minnesota Hospitals.
With me is Dr. John Najarian, Chief of Surgery at the University of Minnesota. Doctor, we know to this point really very little about the president's injury, but I will go over what we do know, and maybe we can make some assessments from that. The president appeared to have been shot under the left arm. The bullet lodged in his left chest. The report said that it lodged in the lung. A number of arteries were struck, and there was at least partial collapse of that lung. According to the reports we now have, it missed the heart by 1 inch. What can you tell us, first of all, generally about this type of wound?
Well, this type of wound, a bullet wound of this sort, does cause a lot of damage in the lung if it passes through the lung, as it must have in this case. When that happens, 2 things occur. One, that you have loss of blood from the lung by blood vessels that are obviously severed, but in addition that you puncture the lung and so that air leaks out, and with this you get a collapse, or at least a partial collapse of the lung, since it's in a confined cavity and does get compressed by the collapse from the air that escapes into that thorax, or the confined cavity which the lung resides. The important consideration there is whether or not the lung itself that it went through, or the part that it went through, was sufficiently destroyed that it required removal of part of the lung. Sometimes that occurs. Most important considerations are injury to the heart, which I understand that the bullet missed, or injury to very large blood vessels within the lung, which the bullet must have also missed, or he would have had much more difficulty almost immediately upon being hit with the bullet.
Yeah, the president walked into the hospital from his limousine. Obviously, the people around him didn't know he had been hit, and maybe he didn't know it himself for quite some time. Is that customary as well with this type of injury?
That can happen. As I understand it, it was a .22 caliber long pistol. This is a small trajectory, and the amount of damage it would do could be very small unless it hit a large blood vessel, and that he'd lose a little bit of air, a little bit of blood, and he'd still feel pretty good. Sometimes people have even been hit with a .22 caliber gun have not even known that they were hit, because it is such a small bullet. So I think this is highly possible, and if he did walk in, as it was stated he did, I think that this means the injury was probably reasonably minor.
They say he's in good and stable condition at the moment, still in surgery, expected out shortly. The one report also mentioned that he was on a respirator. Is that also something that we can expect in this case?
Absolutely. I think as soon as he goes into surgery and he's anesthetized, then he's on a respirator. You cannot operate on the chest of a patient without putting him on a respirator, because we need to breathe for the patient when we open his lungs or open his chest cavity. As soon as you open the chest cavity, you lose the negative pressure within the chest cavity, and therefore it's necessary to breathe for the patient. The anesthesiologist does this, and this is a respirator, and then he'll probably be on that respirator for a short period of time thereafter until he wakes up from the anesthesia.
He'll have a tube placed in his chest to suck away the air that's escaping from the lung, a chest tube, and this will provide him with an opportunity to re-expand his chest and to get off the respirator. I would guess with any luck he'll be off the respirator this evening or by tomorrow morning.
It was also indicated early on that he had received 1 unit of blood either during or just prior to the surgery. That is not alarming in itself, is it?
No, it isn't. And as a matter of fact, that's a very small amount of blood, 1 unit of blood. And that concerns me just a little that he certainly didn't sustain a very heavy injury. It must have bled later to require the operation. Sometime when they only have that much blood loss, you might be able to get away without operating and just putting in a chest tube and sucking out the blood in the air. So that he must have had a little more damage than was first indicated, and that's the reason why they had to operate.
They've also indicated that they did not remove the bullet in this first surgery. What does that mean to you?
That doesn't mean much. I would think, I don't know where the bullet is. Somebody said, or I think you said, that it was in his lung. I doubt that. If it were, they'd probably get it out. Most likely it's lodged in his back somewhere, probably in the muscles of his back, and if it is, it'd be hard to get to. And in essence, there really would be no reason to try to remove it from there until a later date. We frequently leave bullets in. As a matter of fact, I have a patient who has a bullet in the back of her head and the back of her chest, which has never been taken out because they're in dangerous places and they don't give her any particular difficulty. Unless it gets infected, and bullets frequently are not infected, they don't always need to be removed, as our epics of Western motion pictures once indicated.
President Reagan is 70 years of age. Looking at this particular, I believe they call it a thoracotomy, the operation, and his age, and his, we're all aware that he's in good physical condition. He prides himself on that. What is your prognosis for recovery from this type of an operation and injury?
I think it would be excellent. He's as good a 70-year-old as I've seen. I've seen him up close when I was in California. I know that he stays in excellent shape. He doesn't smoke, and that's certainly a plus on his side as far as recovery from this type of operation would be concerned. And I think that he'll...
This is Reed Collins, CBS News in New York, where we are continuing our coverage of the attempt on the life of President Ronald Reagan, who this afternoon at mid-afternoon in Washington, D.C., was wounded by an assassin's bullet that struck him in the lower chest. He was not severely wounded. He was able to walk into a hospital, having been taken there in his limousine. He has undergone surgery for repair of damage caused by a .22 caliber bullet that pierced the left lower lobe of his lung, apparently, and remains lodged in his chest. He walked into the hospital. He joked with his wife, who was rushed there from the White House, saying, "Honey, I forgot to duck." He joked with the people in the operating room, hoping that they were all Republicans. And apparently he was in good condition at least before the operation began. This chain of events began after the president had completed a speech to a labor union gathering at the Washington Hilton Hotel. He had walked up with his entourage to enter his limousine and go back to the White House, when suddenly a barrage of shots from a .22 caliber pistol rang out. 3 other people were felled right on the sidewalk on the scene. A Treasury agent, a Secret Service man that is, a Washington District of Columbia policeman, and the presidential press secretary, James Brady, aged 40, was shot in the head, severely wounded. Those 3 lay on the ground as the president was rushed into his limousine. He had turned in response, apparently, to the cry of his name, had raised his left arm above his head. It's believed that this was the approximate time that the bullet took effect. He, we're told, didn't really realize this. It wasn't until he was inside the limousine that he realized he had, in fact, been wounded. And then he was taken immediately to the hospital, where the surgery was performed a short time later. There's been a welter of information, and some of it misinformative. First, it was said that it was a .38 caliber pistol that was used. It turned out, fortunately for the parties involved, to be a .22 caliber gun. It has been said that the suspect who was seized on the scene is a John Hinckley of Evergreen, Colorado, his age given as 25. He's identified also as a resident of the Denver suburb of Evergreen, but a man who grew up in Dallas, Texas, where authorities today were gathering information about young Hinckley, information that might perhaps shed just some light on the events or the whys of today. David Dick reports.
School officials in Highland Park, an affluent incorporated community located within the city limits of Dallas, were busy today trying to add more pieces to the background of John Warnick Hinckley, Jr., the man accused of shooting President Reagan. Hinckley's picture appeared in a yearbook. He was identified as a 1973 graduate of Highland Park High School. He had been a member of the Student Government Club, the Spanish and the Rodeo Clubs. Later, he attended Texas Tech University in Lubbock, but returned to the Dallas area before graduating. After that, Hinckley moved with his family to Denver. A junior high school acquaintance here recalled he was a real nice guy, moody sometimes, but one who never talked about guns. David Dick, CBS News, Dallas.
And that is what little light can be shed on the man who has now been formally charged with having attempted to shoot the president and who did do it, young John Hinckley.
Phil, I suppose we have received word, by the way, that the president is now out of the operating room in recovery, the surgery having been finished. A hospital briefing is expected soon, so we should have some official announcement about that shortly, and we'll go there for that. But Phil Jones, I was going to suggest, have you heard the talk now about what to do about this, that the president should perhaps be less accessible, that security should be beefed up, or we're going through this sort of barn door locking again?
Well, interestingly enough, many of the senators and members of the Capitol Hill Police Force were commenting after the whole thing that they had been concerned about his safety and security. When he was on the Hill just a few weeks ago for that meeting with congressional leaders to discuss all of his strategy on the budget, that was with Republicans, as he departed the Capitol building, he stopped to talk with reporters. And after that, walked a few steps to his car, and just alongside his car, I guess only probably 25 or 30 feet from that vehicle, were probably 200 people who had gathered. They had been on Capitol Hill tours, and they had all gathered around to wave and see the President of the United States. And he stood up on the car and waved at these people. And this went on for about, I guess 30 seconds. Finally, he got down, got in the car, and drove off. And I looked over at some of the Capitol Hill police, and they were just shaking their heads and sort of a sigh of relief. And one of them said to me, "Thank goodness he is gone now. We don't have to worry about him. He's no longer on our turf." And they were clearly concerned about his exposure at that time. And you can't police everybody. When you have him out in the open like that, you never know who is going to move in and be in that crowd. And I would think that certainly when he comes on the Hill, security will be intensified. But generally, many of them were saying that it should have been much tighter long before this.
Is there any thought given as to how the alleged assailant could have made his way among the supposedly credentialed core of news people there?
Not much. One Senate aide came up to me after the whole incident and said, "Just want you to know that a lot of the senators were saying down there as they were talked about it, it was obviously a reporter who had taken the shots." There has always been a great deal of concern about people coming inside the area where reporters are allowed to roam when the president is out in the open like this. And many times reporters get upset because the security is heavy and everybody is being checked closely. And it's just for this very reason that it is done, because it's very easy for somebody to slip through and appear to be a reporter. But I don't think that anybody on the Hill at this point is thinking about anything like this. There's not much talk about whether or not this will help those who want to get some sort of handgun legislation. The only concern right now is for the president and those who were injured.
So, Congressman Jim Wright, who's a Democrat of Texas, was, however, with Vice President Bush as news of the attack reached them all the way down in Texas. And it's interesting, I think, Phil, to listen as Wright tells reporters the reaction of George Bush.
Of course, his mood was one of shock and utter disbelief.
He said, among other things, he said that he hadn't known Mr. Reagan extremely well for an extremely long period of time, but he found it utterly incomprehensible that anyone could work up a feeling of sufficient malice toward Ronald Reagan to want him dead. I think the mood of the Vice President was one that all Americans would find very commendable in the personal sense. He was in complete control of himself and of his emotions. He was, of course, stunned, as all of us were, by the shocking news. And yet there was not a moment's hesitation in his mind as to what his duty was, what he should be doing. He certainly wasn't indecisive. He was decisive, but he was very calm.
That's the reaction of Congressman Jim Wright, describing the reaction of the Vice President to word that the President had been wounded. We don't have the official word from the hospital, but we get some word anyway on Mr. Reagan's post-operative prognosis. Our correspondent, Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Reed, I'm told that the president is out of surgery, that he's also out of danger. Sources very close to the president, sources at the scene, say the prognosis is good to excellent, that he will be placed in intensive care as you would expect after such an operation, that by tomorrow he should be resting comfortably. I'm also told that they found a fragment in his chest and were able to remove that. So once again, the prognosis for the president, I am told, is good to excellent.
Well, Diane, I'm sure that people who have been a little bit confused by the lack of word are glad to hear that. How is it that you get that at the White House before we get it from the hospital? Want to tell?
Got to have some secrets. One other additional piece of information, Reed. I'm told that the Vice President is here in the White House, that he's in the basement Situation Room. He's been being briefed on the afternoon events and been talking to the other cabinet members who are clustered there.
And so I suppose that includes the Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, who became fairly visible early in the day.
That's right, and other cabinet members had also gathered over here, and I'm told that they, too, are still in the White House. I think you could probably expect at some point the president would go to see the vice president would go to see the president. But again, given that he's going to be in intensive care for a while, it might not be tonight.
Do you know, Diane, is Mrs. Reagan still at the hospital? I presume so.
I understand that she is, and this must have been very good news for her. Again, this information came to me recently, but I'm told that he could have been out of the operation for at least 20 minutes to a half an hour. Back to you, Reed.
Thank you, Diane Sawyer, who has a bit of information there to the effect that everything is going fairly well. Let's go now to the hospital itself and a briefing on the post-operative condition of Mr. Reagan.
Is out of surgery and is in good condition. And I have brought with me here this evening Dr. Dennis O'Leary, who is the Dean for Clinical Affairs at George Washington University Hospital. I got that? Dr. O'Leary will brief you on the president's operation and on his condition, as well as that of the Secret Service agents. Following that, Sheila Patton, who is Mrs. Reagan's press secretary, will have a word to say about Mrs. Reagan. So now, let me introduce to you Dr. Dennis O'Leary. Doctor.
Thank you. Podium. Mr. Nostiker has told you the president is in the recovery room. He is in stable condition, and he is awake. He was in no time in any serious danger. He was alert and awake with stable vital signs up until the time he underwent anesthesia. He was in the operating room for approximately 2 hours. Part of that time was spent ascertaining that he did not have any blood in his abdominal cavity. Indeed, he did not. It was a single bullet wound that entered slightly underneath the left armpit. It traversed about 3 inches of the chest wall and then ricocheted off the 7th rib into the left lower lobe of the lung and moved about 3 inches into the lung substance itself. The operative incision is about 6 inches in width. Relatively simple procedure. The bullet was removed, and then the incision was closed. And as I say, he is stable and in good condition.
What is the prognosis?
The prognosis is excellent.
And you're saying that he will no doubt recover. How long is that, Doctor?
That is always difficult to say. The president, however, is an excellent physical specimen, and we do not anticipate any problems. It is always hard to be precise as to how long he'll be hospitalized, but he is clear of head and should be able to make decisions by tomorrow, certainly.
Did the bullet fragment when it hit the lung? Did the bullet fragment when it hit the lung?
The bullet was distorted, and we believe it probably was distorted by virtue of impacting against the seventh rib, which redirected its path into the lung tissue.
How permanent on the heart?
We do not believe there's any permanent injury. The heart area was explored. The heart was not involved at all. There were no major bleeding points in the lung, and there was no involvement of the aorta, the major vessel running through the chest. The lung has been reinflated. He has a couple of chest tubes in. Excuse me? I can't hear you. Okay, Mr. McCarthy had a single bullet wound also, entered the posterior right chest, and passed through the lung tissue, causing virtually no damage at all except for the passage tract, passed through the diaphragm into the dome of the liver, and passed through the liver into the lateral side of the chest, where it lodged against the end of the 11th rib. Mr. McCarthy did have blood in his abdominal cavity. The same test that was performed on the president was also performed on him, and it was positive. The abdominal cavity was carefully explored, and the only damage was the bullet through the liver itself, and a drain was placed in this area, and he is doing extremely well. Has been in the intensive care unit now for about 45 minutes. Okay, Mr. Brady is still in surgery. His condition is critical. We don't have any further information at this time.
Dr. O'Leary, how long would you anticipate that the president would remain hospitalized?
Now, that is difficult to say. Might be as long as 2 weeks, but that is just a guesstimate at this point in time.
Hasn't been given any blood? How much blood do you have
Sorry. Okay.
Remain here, Doctor.
That's not for me to answer. Question was the amount of blood. The president required a transfusion of approximately 5 units of blood before surgery, but none during the course of surgery. Mr. McCarthy required no transfusion at all.
The D.C. policeman, please.
The D.C. policeman was taken to the Washington Hospital Center. We have no first-hand information on him.
Mr. Brady's injuries.
Well, Mr. Brady was shot in the side of the forehead. The bullet went, I'm not certain, sir. The bullet did pass through his brain and came out the other side. He obviously has significant brain injury, and he is in critical condition, but I'm sorry we have no further information at this time.
Dr. O'Leary, who performed the operation on the president?
The operation on the president was performed by Dr. Ben Aaron, who's on our full-time faculty here as a cardiovascular thoracic surgeon. Last name is spelled capital A, small a, R-O-N. First name Benjamin.
Title?
I'm trying to think. I think he's an associate professor of surgery.
Doctor, you would anticipate no further surgery necessary?
The other surgeon was Dr. Joseph Giordano, Giordano, who is head of our trauma team and was in the emergency room almost simultaneously with the arrival of the president.
Why did the operation take so long?
The length of the operation really had a lot to do with the testing to make sure that there was no bleeding into the abdominal cavity. It took about 45 minutes. It's called a peritoneal lavage. Peritoneal lavage, L-A-V-A-G-E. Okay, that test is important, is very simple. A small incision is made beneath the umbilicus, and several liters of fluid are placed into the abdomen, and then the fluid is brought back outside and looked at to determine whether there's any blood in it. That fluid can move anywhere throughout the whole abdominal cavity, and if any organ has been damaged and there's any bleeding, one will find blood in the fluid that comes out. That test was negative in the president, and as I said, positive in Mr. McCarthy.
Doctor, in view of the president's age, is there any danger that the lung might collapse again?
Very doubtful. The president is physiologically very helpful. Caliber of the bullet is going to be very hard to tell in the president because it was a really mangled bullet.
Is there a possibility of any other complications besides the lung problem?
It's really doubtful. Again, I would emphasize that he is physiologically very young. In good shape.
Where the bullet entered, at what angle? From the front, from the rear? Can you give us
Well, one would assume that it probably seemed to come from a little bit top down, entering approximately here, traverse down. Yeah. Traverse down approximately 3 inches, striking the top of the 7th rib laterally, and then going about 3 inches into the tissue of the lung itself.
Is it left downward further from the 7th rib?
No, it's like coming down, hitting the rib, and then deflecting in to take a new path about and then
lose blood.
It was in the parenchyma in the tissue of the lung itself, contained within the lung itself.
You said the president was conscious through much of the time. What, if anything, did he say?
Well, the surgeons said that his last remark before he underwent anesthesia was he wanted to make sure that all of them were Republicans. They said that today everyone is a Republican.
How narrowly did the president escape mortal injury?
That's a hard question to answer. As I stated, he was never in any serious danger. The bullet was really not very close to any vital structure.
How far is not so close? How far from the heart?
Probably several inches.
Was that because he struck the rib? Was it fortunate?
If it had not struck the rib, it might not have even entered the lung cavity. And you could have passed right through the chest wall if it had not struck the rib.
Politically speaking, the president is fully able to discharge the duties of his office as of now?
I would say probably not now. One has to let the effects of the anesthesia wear off, but I think all of us feel that by tomorrow that he would be fully capable of doing that.
There was a basic decision he had to make tomorrow, of decision of state of some significance. Would he be able to do it?
We believe that he would be able to do it.
Dr. Brady. Who's operating on Dr. Brady?
Okay, Dr. Arthur Cobrine, K-O-B-R-I-N-E. Cobrine, K-O-B-R-I-N-E, is operating on Mr. Brady. Arthur. He is an associate professor of neurosurgery.
Is it possible to give us any prognosis on James Brady?
It's really not possible right now. As I said, he's in critical condition, but anything I would say would be highly speculative. Not at the present time, although in the operating room, remember that you've got respirators and monitors and what have you, and well, almost anyone undergoing brain surgery would be on a respirator.
Dr. O'Leary, aside from the obvious gunshot wound, did the president suffer any other injuries, or were there any abrasions, contusions surrounding being put to the limousine or the melee that occurred at that time?
Well, not as we're able to ascertain. It's possible that we missed a small contusion here or there, but he was gone over quite carefully.
The president was to this hospital, and when did the hospital receive word from the ambulance that he would be on the way?
Well, I can't tell you for certain, but I believe we were probably the closest hospital, which would have been the prudent thing to do. I received information at about 20 of 3 that he was in the emergency room, and I think he probably got there around 2:30.
Who got there first, Brady or Reagan?
No, okay, I'm not sure who got there precisely first. They all came very fast.
About Brady, did you have to go out and get any of the blood from any other source? Did you have enough in the house?
Well, we maintain a stock of blood, but please remember we do not run our own blood bank. The Red Cross has a regional center that is very nearby, and we have all the blood we need within minutes.
Did you have enough immediately, or was it in the house?
Yes. Doctor,
when he was shot?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Doctor, doesn't require 5 units of blood.
Okay, it appears as if the major reason for bleeding within the chest was as a consequence of the hole made when the bullet actually entered the lung substance itself. That's the only bleeding size that really could be determined, and although he bled down about 5 units of blood, it was never very brisk. It was kind of a steady bleeding. It was very easy to transfuse him and keep up with his blood loss.
What is 5 units of blood? How much blood is that?
Well, let's see, how can I make that simple? It's about 2.5 quarts. Total of 2.5 quarts.
Has the president collapsed?
What? Question about collapsed over here.
Did his lungs still collapse?
No, he has a chest tube in. All one has to do is, usually through a chest tube, is to get it in and get the air out of the space between the lung and the chest wall, and the lung expands. He had a chest tube placed in the chest in the emergency room within minutes after he was in the emergency room.
He's again breathing normally.
Yes.
Is Reagan suffering any emotional medical trauma right now?
I think we'll let someone else deal with that question.
Would you recommend that the president not be moved from this hospital for the next few days?
I would say for the next few days it would probably be reasonable not to move him, but I would expect that he will do well, and that'll be a judgment of someone else at that time.
Did he need any more surgery?
We have no reason for believing that significant post-operative problems will develop.
Doctor, are you in a position, Doctor?
Might have to undergo as a result from this operation?
I would really doubt it. He had a simple procedure. There was very little necessity to cut a lot of tissue, and we have every expectation that he'll have a normal post-operative course. I don't know the answer to that question.
Doctor, are you in a position to recreate the first few moments when he came into your emergency room? Did he walk in? What were the first things that were done?
Okay, I was not personally there, but my understanding is that he got out of the car and stood up and walked in on his own. As I say, he was alert and awake all the time. No.
Did he ever enter shock?
Not to the best of our knowledge.
Did he ever collapse when he was carried on stretcher?
Well, I think as soon as he appeared, he may not have wanted to be on a stretcher, but that is our usual procedure for someone who's had a gunshot.
How far inside the chest did the bullet go?
About 3 inches. Okay, I'll give you maybe 4 inches. We're giving you an inch for the thickness of the chest wall.
Dr. O'Leary, can you explain why it was that there was no immediate announcement that the president had been shot? Is it possible, clinically speaking, that he might not have immediately been aware that he was shot?
I really can't answer that question. I wish I could.
When he came in, did he know that he had been injured?
Yeah, I think he knew that he had been shot.
Visible signs? Were there any visible signs when he entered the hospital?
No, I think, again, I'm giving this to you secondhand. I gather he seemed a little bit lightheaded, but he was cracking jokes and in very good spirits even at that time.
The chest tube, when you placed the chest tube to re-expand his lung, you said immediately in the emergency room. What did that consist of? Was that an incision? Did you have to put it down his throat?
No. Usually a small incision is made between the ribs, and the tube is placed in and then attached to suction.
And that was the first emergency procedure?
I'd say that was the first emergency procedure.
Would that be taking the blood off that was coming from the wound in the lung?
There's probably 2 basic purposes. One is if there has been any deflation of the lung, major purpose is to re-expand the lung, remove the air, and the other is to provide drainage for any blood in the lung space.
Will Mr. Brady suffer any permanent brain damage if he survives?
I'd have to say that probably is likely, but I really can't give you any more information since he is still in surgery.
Doctor, how long elapsed between when the president was brought to the hospital and he went into surgery, and can you account for that time?
I would say he went, from the time he hit the hospital to the time he went into surgery, probably was no more than about 40 minutes. There were a variety of things being done. He had to have blood tests performed to find out how much blood he had lost. We had to check his blood gases to determine how much oxygen was getting into his circulation. I think the thing that probably took most times getting the x-rays necessary to determine the extent of the injury, since he had to have both a chest x-ray and an abdominal x-ray.
Doctor, not removing the bullet, repairing the lung without actually removing the bullet. There was an earlier report that might be the case.
Well, I saw those reports, but at the time those reports were out, the surgeons had not even entered the chest as yet.
So you always plan to remove the bullet?
I think every effort would be made to remove the bullet, but if it took a lot of additional extensive surgery, that might have caused a different decision.
Timetable a bit. You say arrived at 2:30 and 40 minutes later went into the operating room, but I thought you said the surgery began around 4.
No. He got to the operating room maybe 3:15, 3:20. Okay, he has to get into the operating room on the table, get under anesthesia in order for surgery to start. So surgery started roughly between 3:30 and 3:45, and it lasted until about 5:30.
Operation is being performed on Mr. Brady if indeed the bullet passed through his brain.
Okay, he is, very simply, he's having a craniotomy, which simply means an exploration of the inside of the head. Craniotomy, craniotomy.
I find it extraordinary that a 70-year-old man could be shot in the lung and then walk into the hospital under his own power.
I think it speaks well for the physiologic health of the president. We do have elderly people, much more elderly than the president is, who do undergo chest surgery, but he certainly sailed through it.
We'll call it medically extraordinary, though.
Maybe not medically extraordinary, but just short of that, okay?
Doctor, you said the bullet was mangled. Is there any possibility that bullet fragments might remain inside the president's body?
That is a finite possibility, but the bullet did, although mangled, seemed to be intact. You're never sure that you have every tiny little fragment out.
Has the president been told of Mr. Brady's condition?
I don't think that he is alert enough really to assimilate that information, and I don't know really what we would tell him at this juncture, since we're not sure yet what the story is.
Doctor, can you talk a little bit about what the body goes through, how much of a shock to the body it is when you go through an operation like the president went through, and do you expect any of that shock, if there is any, to be aggravated by the president's age?
Well, I'd say anytime anyone undergoes major surgery, a thoracotomy is major surgery. It's not extraordinary surgery, but it's major surgery. That would be a stress for any one of us. It'd be a stress for me. But the critical element is the physiological health of the person and your ability to maintain their vital signs and their blood volume satisfactorily. The president's vital signs were absolutely rock stable through this whole thing.
Why don't they take the DC policemen someplace else?
Well, that is a decision really made by the ambulances. But I think that we do have several trauma centers in the District of Columbia, and to the extent that one center does not get many very seriously injured patients, all of our ability is to care for the patients is increased. Obviously, in the heat of a situation, people do the best they can. If you track back where that decision was made, it's sometimes hard to find out who really made that decision.
To make the incision, and how large was it?
The incision's about 6 inches long, and it extends basically from about here into the posterior part underneath the armpit. Okay. About from here to here. You see it? Here to here. Just underneath the nipple. Again, hard to tell. He's a healthy guy, and I'm sure this is a painful injury and even moderately painful surgery, but he withstood it very, very well.
Dr. Larry, is this a procedure that hospitals in urban areas have to do frequently? Gunshot wound to the chest?
Yes. No question.
Will he be in pain for days or weeks or months?
His surgeons believe that he will probably be in moderate pain. That will probably not be for more than a day or two.
You had to cut through muscle, didn't you?
You have to cut through chest wall muscle. That's
pretty rugged muscle to cut, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be painful.
about average muscle.
You told us what the surgeons tried to do to the president. You told us what the surgeons did to the president. What are they doing or trying to do to alleviate Brady's condition?
Well,
exactly what happens after they open.
Okay, I can't, again, anything I'm telling you is rather speculative. Normally, they would have to remove the tissue that seemed irreparably damaged. Anytime you're operating inside the head for very obvious reasons, you try and salvage as much tissue as you think has a remote chance of recovering. This is not a good injury. It causes a lot of damage.
Possibilities of some of the mangled bullet remaining. Would there ever be in the near future a need to go back and reoperate?
I said that was extremely remote.
Doctor, you said that Mr. Brady is fighting for his life?
Well, I think any time a patient is in critical condition, in a sense, he's fighting for his life.
Did the president get any first aid in the car on the way over?
I really can't answer that question. I don't know.
Doctor, what type of medication is the president on, or will he be on while he's in the hospital? Is he on any IVs or any painkillers?
Well, one would, he's on an intravenous solution right now. He, as I said, he required no blood intraoperatively. And as with any patient, the medications really depend upon what the patient's needs are. I would expect the president is probably not going to need very many medications, except perhaps some modest painkillers for a day or so.
What type of recuperation is normal for a person of his physiological age? Do you expect him to be back to normal routine within, say, 2 months?
Depends on a totally normal routine. I would guess probably a couple of months after his hospitalization, so maybe 2.5 to 3 months might be a good guess, but it is a guess.
Would you recommend that he leave Washington for, say, his ranch where there's a less stressful situation around him for a while?
Well, that's really up to him and his staff. I'm sure that he will be adequately protected.
What was the Brady's brain waves? Were they flat? Or what can you tell us they were?
I don't know the answer to that question.
And doctor, would you advise him to take off further time beyond the time that he's hospitalized?
Well, taking off time depends on what you're talking about.
Away from the duties of the presidency.
That's really not my judgment to make for him. I think that I would urge him to limit his physical activity within reason. There is no reason to believe that he has any impairment of his ability to make decisions or what have you. Making decisions is stressful business, but I think he's going to be fully up to it.
Doctor, earlier there was a report that the bullet missed the heart by an inch. You said it missed by several inches. Several inches is a relatively large amount of time. In front of your chest, it seems to intersect the heart, and there's much closer than that.
Okay, I think.
How close it came?
Well, I wasn't specifically there in the operating room. I think I know where those reports came because remember when we're in an operating room, the only x-ray that we can really get that's going to be valid is one that is taken from front to back. Okay, and when you held that up, it looked as if the bullet was close to the heart, but you were missing that third dimension. And in that third dimension, it turned out that the bullet was significantly removed from the heart by several inches, as I've said. It was not close.
Dr. Dennis O'Leary finishing off his analysis of the president's operation and his medical condition. The question's beginning to wind down a little bit. What the doctor said, in case you came in a little late, this news conference has gone for about 25 minutes. What he said at the beginning was that at no time was the president in any serious danger. He was in the operating room for about 2 hours. The bullet ricocheted off his 7th rib, went about 3 inches into the left lung. The bullet was removed, and he said repeatedly, in fact, that the president's prognosis is excellent because he's such a marvelous physiological specimen. He said that the president is now clear of head and that he should be able to make decisions tomorrow. And he was questioned on that at some length, as you may have heard, and he said the president would be fully capable of making decisions of state by tomorrow. He might be on some modest painkiller, but that's about all. As to the president's progress through the operation, he said, well, he's certainly sailed through it. His vital signs absolutely rock stable through the entire operation. So that is the medical report on the president's condition as given by Dr. Dennis O'Leary, who is the Dean of Clinical Affairs at the George Washington University Hospital, the nearest hospital to the president at the time of his accident and one of the finest of the assassination attempt and one of the finest teaching hospitals in the city. There were several questions, as you may have heard, about moving the president, and that once again is because in general presidents are taken to either of the two major military hospitals, either Walter Reed Army Hospital or to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that is strictly for reasons of security. Both those hospitals have isolated suites which are very well guarded by military guards and are well removed from any place that the public could get into. George Washington University Hospital, as simply an ordinary hospital, does not have in general that kind of facility. So there was some question as to whether after a few days the president might better be moved to one of the two military hospitals. And Dr. O'Leary naturally said repeatedly that that was not his decision to make. That was a decision of state and security, not a medical decision, but that probably he shouldn't be moved for a few days. So, Reed Collins in New York, that is the medical assessment of the condition of President Reagan. At this point, his condition is excellent, at no time in any serious danger.
Thank you, George Herman. And that sort of wraps up what has been a long stanza in the history of contemporary Americana. Mr. Reagan, wounded by an apparent would-be assassin this afternoon. 3 others shot down with him as they exited a hotel in downtown Washington, D.C., Those 3, the president's press secretary, James Brady, who, as we have heard, has suffered a wound in the brain. He obviously is, the most serious among those who were wounded. A Secret Service agent, Timothy McCarthy, wounded in the right chest. A District of Columbia policeman, Thomas Delahanty, also wounded, apparently a neck wound that has some nerve involvement. And the president himself, the eldest and the most visibly important of all, perhaps, wounded in the chest, but recovering after 2 hours of surgery, as we just have heard. His wife, Mrs. Reagan, remains with him. One of his children, at least, is busy flying in from Nebraska. The Vice President, George Bush, is on the ground in Washington, in the briefing room in the White House, prepared to do whatever this day requires of him as far as taking over the reins if that is necessary. It would be indicated, however, it will not be, according to the medical briefing we just heard. In custody, a young man, 25 years of age, from Evergreen, Colorado, named John Hinckley, who is believed to have been the assailant who wielded a .22 caliber pistol this afternoon in Washington, D.C., and wounded these 4 men: Reagan, Brady, McCarthy, Delahanty. A bad day for the Irish and a bad day for their country. This is Reed Collins, CBS News, New York.
Now the announcement is made that the Vice President is on his way down to the press room. So we should be hearing from him very shortly. Here is the Deputy Press Secretary,
Vice President
Larry
will be in the
Speake.
briefing room shortly. For your information, the Vice President landed at Andrews at 6:30. He came to the Situation Room at 7 o'clock, which he presided over a meeting of some members of the Cabinet. He will make a brief statement. I will not take questions, but I will follow and take some questions.
Now, that was Larry Speake, the Deputy Press Secretary. He's turned away from the podium. And now here is the Vice President, George Bush.
Well, I have a very brief statement that I would like to read. I am deeply heartened by Dr. O'Leary's report on the President's condition. That he has emerged from this experience with flying colors and with the most optimistic prospects for a complete recovery. I can reassure this nation and a watching world that the American government is functioning fully and effectively. We've had full and complete communications throughout the day and the officers of the federal government have been fulfilling their obligations with skill and with care. I know I speak on behalf of the President and his family when I say that we are very grateful to so many people from across this country who've expressed their concern at this act of violence. And finally, let me add our profound concern on behalf of 2 brave law enforcement officers who serve to protect the President, and then, of course, for a friend of everybody here, dedicated public servant Jim Brady. We're going to watch their progress with all our prayers, with all our hopes. And now I'm going to walk over and speak briefly to Mrs. Reagan, who's returned to the residence. Thank you all very much.
And the press secretary turns away to leave the briefing room. Or rather, the vice president, I should say, George Bush. And now we'll be hearing from the deputy press secretary.
Let me go over what I know to be the situation as I saw it here. As I said, the vice president arrived in the situation at Andrews at 6:30. He came to the situation room at 7 o'clock. Was present in that meeting, and this is not necessarily in any order, but it's more or less the way they were sitting at the table. The vice president, of course, Ed Meese, Richard Allen, Secretary Lewis, Attorney General Smith, Secretary Weinberg, Secretary Reagan, Admiral Murphy of the Vice President's staff, Jim Baker, the White House Chief of Staff, and Secretary Haig. Also Secretary Block, Secretary Baldrige, Secretary Watt, and CIA Director Casey. In addition, there were other staff members present, such as Martin Allen and David Gergen and Max Friedersdorf and Fred Fielding. The meeting continued for about 30 minutes, at which time the medical press conference from the hospital came on the television, and we watched that basically to its conclusion. The vice president then went to his office, drafted the statement, and came here. Mrs. Reagan has returned from the hospital, as the vice president said, and he's now going over to visit with her. As far as tomorrow, we will basically continue with the schedule as the president had planned. There is a plan for a brief meeting of the cabinet, a plan for a brief meeting with the congressional leadership, and then to continue with the schedule, which includes a meeting and a working luncheon with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Messages of concern and good wishes are coming into the White House from around the world, most speaking of shock and horror at the attack today on President Reagan. None perhaps says more than did the president's daughter, Maureen Reagan, in Los Angeles.
I am not prepared to accept this, whether it was my father or anybody else. I have seen throughout the day the reaction of other members of the family. Mine is fury and rage and anger, and that in this country, this kind of garbage still goes on, and it is not going to happen to this president. By God, it is not going to happen to this president, really. And I think that the American people have got to become angry about the crime in this country, about the ability of people to do this to other human beings, and we have got to stop it, and we've got to stop it right now.
What can be done, she was asked. She says Americans can get angry. More in a minute. The latest word from the White House, then, is that President Reagan is in good condition tonight, following surgery for gunshot wounds he received in an assassination attempt this afternoon. Reports are that he's cracking jokes, writing on a pad of paper now that all in all, he'd rather be in Philadelphia. David Jackson, CBS News.
Remarkable, isn't it? He was joking on his way into the hospital. He was joking on his way into the operating room. And now late word is that he is joking, having come out of the surgery with a prognosis being excellent.
Larry, has the president turned over control or authority to the vice president?
There has been no cause for that to take place.
Well, the president will be under sedation at least until tomorrow morning. Can't we assume that the vice president would have to be able to take charge in that case, Larry?
Well, there is, for your information, an automatic assumption of command authority that requires no steps be taken. It goes first on the vice president and second on the Secretary of Defense.
Doesn't it go to the Speaker after the Vice President?
Let me get straight with you so you can understand it. There is a succession procedure. That goes from the President to the Vice President to the Speaker to the President pro tempore. There's another one called the Command Authority, which is an automatic assumption. And that's the only thing that happened at this time.
Who is the Commander-in-Chief tonight at this hour?
Well, certainly the President is the Commander-in-Chief. If any actions are required, I'm sure that it would be taken by the appropriate official in the government.
Larry Speaks, the Deputy White House Press Secretary, earlier this evening. As for the alleged assailant, the man who shot and wounded President Reagan, Jim Brady, his press secretary, and 2 other men, we have this report now from John Ferrugia in Washington.
John W. Hinckley, the man suspected of shooting the president and 3 others, is being held at an FBI office in southwest Washington. An FBI spokesman says Hinckley is being interviewed by federal agents, and he has 2 court-appointed attorneys with him. Hinckley has asked for and received a doctor after complaining of a sore throat, but an FBI spokesman says he seems physically well otherwise. Hinckley will undergo more questioning by federal agents tonight, and then later tonight be taken to the federal district courthouse in Washington for a preliminary hearing. Meanwhile, an FBI spokesman says an investigation has begun into Hinckley's background and said that investigation is centered in the western United States. He would say no more. An FBI spokesman also indicated that right now there are no other suspects in this assassination attempt. John Ferrugia, CBS News at the FBI office in Washington.
We've also been told by the FBI that Hinckley was arrested last October 9th in Nashville, Tennessee, while then-President Jimmy Carter was in that city. William Brissy, a captain of the Nashville Airport Security Police, said Hinckley was taken into custody for trying to board an airliner with 3 handguns and 50 rounds of ammunition. The guns were confiscated, Hinckley was fined, and then released. The manager of a pawn shop in Dallas, Texas, says Hinckley purchased 2 .22 caliber pistols there in October of last year. And the FBI also says that Hinckley had a prior detention, if not an arrest, in Memphis within the past 6 months, detained there by local police in connection with what they called a property crime. He was fined and released. In a brief statement to reporters issued from their home near Denver tonight, Hinckley's parents said their son was recently under psychiatric care. They made no reference to the nature of the problem he was being treated for, but they said the evaluation did not alert us to the seriousness of the problem. Mr. Reagan's predecessor in office had some comment on today's events. That report now from John Sheehan in Plains, Georgia.
An aide to former President Carter said that Mr. Carter had expressed surprise at hearing reports that the suspect, John Hinckley, had been arrested in Nashville, Tennessee, carrying weapons last October. At the same time, President Carter was in the Tennessee city conducting a town meeting at the Grand Ole Opry. Mr. Carter himself has remained in seclusion at his home here in Plains, Georgia, since hearing the first reports of the shooting in Washington. He put out a statement saying he's thankful for the reports that President Reagan's condition is good and that he wishes President Reagan a speedy recovery. The statement goes on to say that Rosalind and Jimmy Carter continue to pray for Jim Brady, Tim McCarthy, John Delahanty, and their families. John Sheehan, CBS News, Plains, Georgia.
Former President Richard Nixon and his wife in New York were said to be praying for the president, and that according to their daughter, Tricia Nixon Cox. Former President Gerald Ford is in Tokyo on a business trip. In a telephone interview tonight with CBS News correspondent Douglas Edwards, Mr. Ford said he especially wanted to send reassurances to Mrs. Reagan because he knows that when the 2 attempts were made on his own life in 1975, his wife Betty was more concerned about his life than he himself was. To recap, President Reagan is in good condition, recuperating tonight in a Washington hospital following a gunshot wound, the attempt on his life this afternoon, and we are told that the president will make a full recovery. White House Press Secretary James Brady, also wounded in the attack, is in serious condition, as is Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy.
A Washington policeman, Thomas Delahanty, also wounded, is in serious but stable condition. Arrested and being held in Washington is 25-year-old John Hinckley of Colorado. I'm Doug Poling in New York, and this has been a special report from CBS News.